Got a very special guest with us tonight that we're very excited to have here. But before we get to that, while we're waiting for a few more people to arrive, we'd like you to in, identify in the chat the indigenous territory on which you live. If you don't know what that is, you can see there on the screen that phone number. Just text your zip code to that and it'll tell you which indigenous territories you're residing on. We do this because our Native American brothers and sisters are in this country and throughout the world really invisible. And they're a very, very important part of our collective history and our present existence as well. And they have been holding this land in trust for us for so many years. And we owe them great debts of gratitude and acknowledgement and support for their struggles as well. So please put that information in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'd like to share my gratitudes and thank yous for the folks that help make this series possible every week or every second and fourth Saturday, which is when we meet. And first off, I'd like to thank our presenter who's here today. You'll hear more about him in detail later, but his name is Justice Castaneda. And we'd like to thank him for coming out from Madison, Wisconsin. And he is an expert on this topic. I've heard him, he is phenomenal. We are gonna get a great education in here. And so start writing your questions if you didn't already. He probably will answer many of them in the course of his presentation, but we're looking forward to hearing from him. And thank you again, Justice, for coming out and giving us some of your valuable time. He is a real community warrior, and this man is always busy doing something in service of the community. So again, we really appreciate him being here today. Also, as always, our tech team, Jillian and Nason Sturdivant, we'd like to thank them very much, yes, for taking care of all the technical stuff and our slides and all the things that make this look good and sound good and work well. Let's see, am I missing anyone else in particular? Oh yes, this evening, those that have helped put together our devotional program, Regina Yonker, Milton Conway, if he's here, I am expecting him, I haven't seen him yet. Mayron from South Dakota. And am I missing anybody? Oh, and of course, Nason is gonna grace us with the prayer for the departed that he's actually gonna sing for us this evening. So that too is a very special treat. So thank you all so much for that. Okay, while some of you are working on your recognizing or identifying your indigenous territory, we also want to take this time to call in our ancestors. And during this period, Nason will be singing for us the prayer for the departed. We do this because our ancestors, be they of blood or spirit, they're able to assist us in this life, and we are able to assist us in their next plane of existence as well. And so we invite them to be of service and to guide us and to support us in all those endeavors that are meet and seemly, as you might say. So during this time, if you have anyone you'd like to add in the chat, please go ahead. And of course, you don't have to put names in there if you don't want to. And we'll go ahead and start with Nason with the prayer for the departed.
Oh my God, O thou forgiver of sins, bestower of gifts, dispeller of affliction, verily I beseech thee to forgive the sins of such as have abandoned the physical garment and have ascended to the spiritual world. Oh my Lord, purify dispels their sorrows and change their darkness into light, cause them to enter the garden of happiness, cleanse them with the most pure water, and grant them to behold thy splendors on the loftiest mount.
Ámame para que yo te ame. Si tú no me llamas, mi amor jamás llegará a ti. Ámame para que yo te ame. Si tú no me llamas, mi amor jamás llegará a ti. Oh, hijo del ser, sábelo mi siervo. Ámame para que yo te ame. Si tú no me llamas, mi amor jamás llegará a ti. Ámame para que yo te ame. Si tú no me llamas, mi amor jamás llegará a ti. Oh, hijo del ser, sábelo mi siervo. Ámame, ámame, ámame.
Justice is not limited. It is a universal quality. Its operation must be carried out in all classes, from the highest to the lowest. Justice must be sacred, and the right of all the people must be considered. Desire for others only that which you desire for yourselves. Then shall we rejoice in the sun of justice, which shines from the horizon of God. From Abdul Baha, Paris Talks.
Thank you, friends. It was lovely. And it's lovely to see so many of you here from many parts of the country: South Dakota, Maryland, Illinois, Chicago, Virginia. It's just great to have you all here. So let me just say a brief, oh, Idaho. Okay, thank you, Julia. I saw that in the chat. So let me just share very briefly with everyone. I know we have some new friends here today about the purpose of this series, and then we're going to go ahead and get right into our presentation with Justice Castaneda. The purpose of this inspired series is racial justice and racial healing. That's the name, and that's why we're doing this. Our watchwords here, though, are very important, and it's that humble posture of learning, to be open to learning, and to be curious and to question, and to take that learning, that knowledge, and to have the will or the volition to do something with it and transform it into action that will transform not just our individual lives, personal lives, but also the lives of our communities. So what unites us here is this a commonly held commitment that we can carry forward an ever advancing civilization that is both materially and spiritually rich. And that the biggest obstacle to obtaining that lofty goal is racial prejudice. Without that, there can be no justice, no true peace, and no true prosperity for humanity. So to that end, as you know, if you've been here before, our topics range from understanding racism in its many facets, which will be touched upon today in particular, as well as healing racial trauma, breaking societal constructs that bolster racism, accepting Black culture, understanding the metaphor in the Baha'i writings about the pupil of the eye, a designation for people of African descent, and why that's important. And coming together to recognize our primordial unity as one human race and the inherent, undeniable joy that we have when we celebrate and protect our diversity, as well as nurture it. So our intent in offering this series is to go beyond just education and understanding, but to take this knowledge and to do something with it. So today I'm very, very excited and very grateful to have with us Justice Castaneda. I first ran across him when I attended a Zoom presentation that my daughter was attending here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm in Middleton now. If some of you don't know, I've moved from Maryland. Now I'm in Middleton. I'm back in the heartland with everybody. And he was doing a presentation with an organization called Urban Triage on redlining. And I was just so impressed. And it's been about a year since I've been trying to get him to come and share his expertise and knowledge with us. So Justice is an educator and community development specialist by trade. He's going to share his professional and academic work, exploring the intersections of housing policy, economic development, and community violence, and the role that those intersections play in educational and life outcomes, particularly for youth, who we know is such an important population, who have experienced traumatic events in early childhood and adolescence. His most recent work explores the relationship between land use policies, including housing policy, and economic/educational outcomes for youth in Madison, Wisconsin. He is currently completing his PhD in urban and regional planning at UW-Madison. He completed his undergraduate work in planning at UC San Diego. He received a Master of Arts in Policy, Organization, and Leadership Studies from the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. And he earned his Master's of City Planning from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he focused on housing policy, community and economic development, before accepting a fellowship with the Center for Health and Communities at the University of California, San Francisco, their medical campus. Justice is a Madison native. His career began in the U.S. Marine Corps, and we thank you, Justice, for your service, where he spent 8 years before being honorably discharged. Before returning to Madison, Justice worked nationally on housing and economic development initiatives for governments and philanthropic partners. So with that, let us welcome Justice Castaneda, and it's all yours, sir. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you for having me. It's really humbling to be here with you all. Last name is technically Castaneda, but just don't call me late to dinner. So it's great to see so many people from so many places. As I was going through this, I realized, because I'm kind of taking this from some work in Madison, I hope that this is universally applied. In a longer form, this is actually an extrapolation of some stuff that I've done with a number of cities. It's hard, with such a diverse and amazing group of folks from all over the country, and I'm just kind of getting a sense, just kind of going through this, just about the different cities and places that I've lived. I've kind of moved around. I just moved back to Madison, Wisconsin in 2017 after I was born here. I actually spent a lot of my childhood locked up in this town before a number of other things happened, ended up here. All that to say, there's so many cities and places, and many of them have been represented on in the chat that have really taken care of me, and I've learned a lot about Madison. By working in a lot of other places, I really started to understand me and understand Madison and the history of this stuff. So I guess I say all that just to say that I want to honor the amazing spots and cities and places throughout that you guys are all from, and acknowledging that in many of these same places, there have been a lot of really great people who have taken care of me. However, as we get into this, if this thing starts to get, now there, obviously in terms of a research thing, the idea is to have a theoretical framework that you're applying or you're bringing to one thing that could actually be taken and looked at in terms of how it applies in a number of other places. So I do welcome folks to stop me and to say, hey, we're not, this is all of a sudden you have to know the nooks and crannies of Madison, Wisconsin in order to really understand what it is you're saying. And then I can definitely stop and kind of explain what that theoretical device is that I'm exploring. And please don't be shy, to use that chat to get some questions. I will try to stop periodically as I go through this, just to see if there's anything in here. I should say I moonlight still. I work with youth. Right. And so I always have one of them whenever we're talking. That's kind of like my my red flag, just, hey, whatever you're saying is not making any sense to me. So so please feel free to do it. All right, we're gonna jump right into this. Is it possible for me to share a screen?
Yeah, absolutely, Justice. Nissan will make that possible for you. And let me say, we keep the chat off during our presentations, so there's cool. Always a conversation going on. It can be distracting for some of us. But what I will do, I'm certainly want to, say, hey, could you explain that a little more, or can you come back to that? So yeah, we can definitely engage, and then we'll have the time afterwards for Q&A from the participants as well.
Okay, great. No, I respect that. So yeah, we'll knock that out. That works.
You don't have to worry about the chat right now.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds great.
Watching the audience.
Okay, great. All right. Well, let's just jump right into this thing.
Okay.
So let's see. I think, can you guys see the screen?
Yep.
All right. I'm gonna do this. All right. So call this the housing mixtape. A lot of things, as many of us know, the kind of an easy analogy I always give people, and this is very reductive, and so just again, very humble to be here with you all. But when you think about an automobile, for instance, one could argue that the engine is the most complex part of an automobile, but without the wheels, you're not going anywhere. And the way I think in terms of community is that, in terms of the social interactions, the cohesion, the civic culture, the arts, the things that make our places special in terms of where we live and love and laugh, that is the most complex part of, good community development. Without the housing, it doesn't go anywhere, right? So the housing is really, having places where people can be settled is really important, but also housing doesn't exist. It's kind of a modular standalone thing, right? So when we're talking about, and we'll hear this in contemporary dialogue or discourse around housing, where there's a lot of focus on just getting people into units of housing without thinking about what happens after that in tenure and a number of these other things. Now, a big thing, one of my personal favorite architects is a guy named Leon Cryer, and I don't know, different things about new urbanists, but I personally appreciate some of his guidance, and he has a thing about archaeology that does not dare to reconstruct. It's about a mere form of necrophilia, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, because I think it's really important to understand the history, and I think the conversations, especially with a lot of really good seminal texts coming out about redlining, the history of covenants and what this has meant into the shape and the structure and the placement of our civic geographies around the United States. People are thinking about redlining, and as it kind of feeds into where people live today and what it's meant historically in terms of transference of wealth, access to capital, etc. I think there's a number of things in terms of civic processes and in terms of the residuals that also affect people's access to democratic processes and institutions that are not as simply, it's not just about physical location. And I'm going to try and bring that into this, which is kind of why I call it a mixtape. All right, so let's get going. So, a lot of this stuff, a big thing here is I want us to understand this stuff, how the land use practices are critical in maintaining extant power structures, and how a lot of it transcends individuals and even, in individual groups. I should say that for those of you that will understand this, and you can build it into your critique of anything I say moving forward, but I do approach this from very much a post-structuralist lens. So, for some people that's, it's not strict, it's not so rigidly post-structural that it's straight Foucault, but it is acknowledging that a lot of these things transcend individuals and that a lot of this stuff becomes codified and baked in to the way that power dynamics exist. So, so we're going to talk about this stuff. I am going to use Madison, Wisconsin as kind of my muse or my analytic focus. This is the land from which I come. I was born at home here, and I spent a lot of my childhood, like I said, locked up, but also unhoused or unsheltered. And this place killed a lot of my people. And so and I kind of got out of here, skin of my teeth, if you will. So there is some things in terms of exploration that I brought into here, into my exploration in Madison. And so there are some things that are specific to Madison, but really this isn't to say that because it's happening exactly the way it's happening here, this is what's happening in all these other places. And I hope that that comes out. All right, so bluff is just a concept, bottom line up front. And that basically the way that housing policy, including the way that land use works contemporary and historic context, is very much a catalytic element or a foundational underpinning in terms of people's access to democratic process institutions. Now, as we've talked, and as sounds like you guys are already exploring redlining and restricted covenants and the way that people have had access to different parts of the city and the economic engines of cities, the academic institutions of cities, including school districts and your K through 12 conventional education spaces, and not just access to them, but the relationship with those things is very much is one explainer, or is one way to understand the realities in terms of our economic and our position today. All right, so just kind of getting into this, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this. This is kind of just for us to get into, seeing these maps, which are the Hulk maps that really kind of cut out a lot of our cities. And so you could look at the Hulk maps for your respective urban area. I have these for, I don't know, I've looked at about 90 of these things for different cities around the United States. And, they're fascinating. And one of the reasons, so this is Madison, Wisconsin. The red areas here were deemed less than desirable areas that made it, really difficult for people to access financing to purchase properties and to purchase housing units. And then also, these are, whether, we all, I think it sounds like we get that that probably wasn't an accident, that was by design, because it also was the only places that, in Madison, specifically talking about Black folks, this is the only places that they were allowed to live or to own property. And again, trying to apply this and understand this, so you kind of look at this geography here, and as it pertains to Madison. This is the downtown. If you don't know, Madison is on the isthmus, which it accelerates something that I call the peripheralization effect. I don't call peripheralization. Peripheralization is peripheralization, but basically what it's saying is it has a way of pushing folks to the periphery and making it much more difficult for them to access the center of economy, which is kind of right downtown and on the isthmus. one of the things that I think is really important, as we're going to get into this, as I'm saying, is the application of the history as it pertains to the way that people live and the social dynamic of contemporary urban culture. So as it's saying, this is very much the case now. So that was the way that was designed then. And when you look at contemporary Madison, Wisconsin, I'm going to just throw up some quick maps. But and what this is showing right here is where your Black populations live today. So again, if you look at this isthmus area and the downtown part of this, you can see that it's not very diverse, and it's very much reminiscent to what happened here. There's a number of gentrifications and systems of gentrification. I teach the graduate seminar on gentrification here at the University of Wisconsin, and I get into that more in there. So like at the end, we could talk a little bit about the intersection of gentrification and displacement and how that kind of fits in here. But there is a real story here. So when you think this is where your Black populations live today, this is where your Latinx populations are living today. So again, you're seeing this kind of pattern of peripheralization in terms of where people are living. One thing that I really appreciated about Madison, Wisconsin, in terms of it using it as an analytical or muse or as a focus of analysis, is that because of the peripheralization effect, it very neatly lays out this periphery effect. You know what I mean? The geography makes this really easy to see. Whereas when you're in places like Boston, or where it's not as clear because the way the capital and access to things work, it's kind of block by block. It's a little bit different in those places, but the same things are happening. Again, this is just Madison kind of provides a very neat geographic presentation of how this works.
Justice, can you give us a little bit of that history about here in Madison, for example, about gentrification? We're kind of basic. We're a little basic, so background would be really great.
Yeah, sure. So the first settlement where Black folks were allowed to live was, sorry, this is kind of small, and I recognize that. This is I should have actually just made this a
Oh, that's real helpful.
So this downtown sliver is what's called the first settlement in Madison. It's right downtown. This was the first gentrification, and what happened is a lot of the folks, first settlers, Black settlers in Madison, were pushed out into this area, that's just south of the word lake here on this map. There's this big red area, and that was called the Green Bush. And that was actually an Italian, Jewish, and Black neighborhood until the mid 20th century. And then, like a lot of places, and people kind of know the stories of urban renewal, that was displaced. And when that happened, again, if you guys, the possessive investment of whiteness and a lot of these other texts and studies that went into when white folks became white, and when it was no longer kind of these separate ethnic groups and it became just kind of white. In Madison, it was no different. And so when they displaced everybody out of the Green Bush, there were only a very few spots around Madison where Black folks could live. And they were all at the periphery of the of the city. And so you had this situation where, again, that history of that, when you think about, all right, so it pushed everybody into these, into the periphery of these cities, and so into the city. And when you look today about where our populations live, I identify as Chicano, we're still in the same places, right? So that history and the historical effect. Now, the thing with the gentrification and with the redlining and everything else is that when you think about in terms of wealth accumulation or inheritance, a big thing is, so this downtown area in the Isthmus, I did a study, a comp study of a property that was, let me get this back up again, that looked at a house that was, I don't know, can you see the little hand? Can you see my little mouse?
Yeah.
Okay.
And just for folks that are not from Madison, Madison is on an isthmus. So that strip that you're seeing, there are two lakes. one up there at the top where it's the city of Madison, and then the other lake is on the other side. So you've got this strip, and then you have more, you know, other urban areas on the other two ends there. So just for my clarification, Justice, so the red that we're seeing on both maps, that's where Black communities are. What are the yellow and the blue and the green represent?
So those represented the more desirable places. The blue in this case, you know, so they have, if you look on the
Oh, there we go.
little legend down here, it kind of goes into this and it kind of shows, you know, what these things meant. The third ward is where I, you know, kind of my office is now. But a house, an example, is over here by this blue. I don't know if you can see my hand. There's a house there that was built at the same year as a house that was over on Bell Street, which is on the south side of Madison. The one on Bell Street is a little bit larger. And when you did a comp, actually, it's older. So the comparable that I did was from 2018. So it's a couple years old. But basically, the house. The big difference is that the house that was over here in the blue is worth just short of $500,000, where the one that was in the red is worth about $250,000. So there's a difference of almost, you know, 100% more in terms of the value. Now, the big difference is that Black folks weren't allowed to live in those neighborhoods, right? So they didn't have access to them. We think about the way that wealth is transferred in the United States. The number one way that it's transferred is through inheritance of property, and that matters because it's, you know, when you're thinking about how do you access capital to open businesses or to fund education or to go into other endeavors, one of the ways to do it, you take a mortgage out of your house, but your significant limitations in terms of access to capital for the families who have been here, and a lot of that just has to do with where they were able to actually the places that they were able to access home ownership or land ownership throughout the 20th century. So that's kind of, you know, again, without getting into the stages and the types of gentrification and what that has meant, because there's a lot more to this in terms of the way that populations have moved. I'm going to get into it actually in a second when I talk about the school district and then the government structure. But so the last map that I have on here is this one. Let me make this a little bigger too. What this is the neighborhood resource teams, and so the neighborhoods that the city sees as hot, or I hate using the word bad, but the neighborhoods of focus, neighborhoods of concern, and so you can, and again, this really clearly. It follows that pattern, right? And when you're thinking about these neighborhoods, I mean, all of them in a Madison political dialogue, I could talk about the history of things like Owl Creek neighborhood. You see this little neighborhood way out here, and how that was even built, and all these things. But for today, for all intents and purposes, the point here is to think about the way that the places today that there is government surveillance in the way of, services, and they need support, all these other things, it very much matches up or can be explained by the history of where housing was allowed and where people had access to ownership and investment throughout the 20th century in particular. And so that story is very real. Another thing, I mean, again, this is more of the gentrification thing, but these neighborhoods, if you're familiar with things like the $1 Million Block Project that was done around central Brooklyn.
No, tell us about that.
So the idea was that a lot of places that are represented by heavy, what they say, extreme poverty or whatever, they actually were, if you looked at the amount of money and expenditure that was spent, either in terms, things as much as like the amount of the court system that is employed because of this thing, or you think about the amount just straight up costs. And, you guys have probably heard someone say that it costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $12,000 to educate a child, and it costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $35,000 to incarcerate them. And people will use that, and that's a true story. But in a strict, and I would say a pathological capitalist model, another way to say that is that you can make $12,000 off a body if you educate them, or you can make $35,000 if they're educated, right? Or sorry, if they're incarcerated. So like in terms of a capital, if you look at it that way, it's saying that actually there's a lot of money represented by folks, being in areas that are considered high crime, that are considered high incarceration rates. And so what they looked at is in these neighborhoods in central Brooklyn that had kind of like a lot of, high crime, all this stuff, they actually, and they were looked at as very, they had high rates of poverty. They actually they were called $1 million blocks because they actually represented heavy amounts of capital that were coming in that, you were able to make off of those neighborhoods, right? And so because I have this in a different thing for the gentrification stuff, but I'll do it real fast. These neighborhoods in Madison, Wisconsin are not big neighborhoods. We're talking in some cases 3 to 4 blocks of very low density relative to other metro areas. So, if you have a house, these are like some of the housing stock that you have in these places are like 4-unit apartment buildings, whereas like in Washington, like get into like New York or St. Louis or some of these places where you have 3,100 units in one, there's nothing like that, right? So what we found is when we looked at this, there were 3 neighborhoods in particular, Darbo, Worthington, Owl Creek, and Teresa Terrace, where there was more money, there were more people that were working in service provision to like support or to I could run a critique on the word empower, to do all this support stuff for these neighborhoods. There were more people getting paid doing service provision than there were people who lived in the neighborhood. And
Wow.
And when I did this I was making a point to the mayor at the time. I was working for the then mayor on circa 2011 through 14 for Madison, doing a project here. And I was showing him that, and you take a public records request of whether it's 501c3 organizations or government, and you show where the people lived who worked in the neighborhoods. You had this thing where a lot of the people were living in these more affluent middle class white areas. And so in a way, what you have is kind of this, by having these peripheralized pockets of concentrated poverty, that was actually used as an economic driver that supported the economy of these other areas. Right now, again, I was trying to make a case. It's more complex. That's a very reductive way to say it. It's not untrue because it's reductive. It's just saying that there's other ways to think about that. But it's a fascination, right? And there is this thing that goes on that in some ways, these neighborhoods are really important in terms of supporting the economy of your more middle class areas, because all the people who work in there don't live in those neighborhoods. In Madison, one thing about Madison and a lot of these neighborhoods that you don't really have, I would say that the South Side corridor to a certain extent is kind of the last representation of this, but you just don't have a Dorchester, or you don't have in East Oakland, or places that are historic mixed income Black or Latinx neighborhoods where you will have very low income folks of color, but you also will have middle class or higher home ownership and stuff like that. That's all in terms of representation or phenotypical presentation, that's all matched up. What you get is a lot of these very, very low income places that have income restricted units, and that's it. So once a person, so it's a really interesting thing that goes on there. But what I guess, again, like I said, this is kind of, we're getting, it's a little bit off of this presentation, but there is this story about having that permanent volatility. The gentrification actually serves as a catalytic element of capital flow, because there is money to be made by the permanent existence of these, like I said, these isolated peripheralized pockets of concentrated poverty. All right. Oh, okay. So I wanted to show one thing, and this, I'm going to show you a map of the school district and the elementary school, the attendance areas real quick, because kind of like what I was saying before, is I want to keep, I want to make sure that I'm bringing this back to contemporary practices. So this map is so intense that it's hard to put on a slide. So I felt like the best way to do this is just to show you guys the map. So what we're looking at here, and again, I'm going to try and make this bigger. My apology. I mean, this stuff is, but so this is the attendance average, the map of the attendance averages. Now, I want to show you one thing that happens in Madison and a lot of places, and it's very much reflective of, I don't know why this thing doesn't want to get any, does not want to zoom in. Well,
Are you trying to make it bigger, Justice?
I am trying.
There's
but-
up at the top bar, you've got the Zoom feature, the little plus button. So you're at 38% right now. Yeah. Yeah. Keep moving your mouse over to the left on that black bar. Yeah. Keep going. And you'll see a plus and minus with the percentage on there.
I did not see this on my screen.
Okay, it's 1, 2, 3. It's on the same line that has MMSD elementary attendance areas 2021, just before the map.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where it is.
Right in the middle.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Nissan.
I am not seeing this
Okay, that's odd. I could see it and you can't. How weird.
because it's still not letting me,
Yeah.
here we go. All right.
Yeah,
cool.
there you
Gotcha.
are.
All right, sorry about that. So I want to show you, this is Stevens Middle School. This is Stevens Elementary School. Now the attendance area of Stevens is
What
this
color?
this brown color here. If you could see Stevens, I'm gonna do that again. I can get it closer. So Stevens Elementary School is
Okay.
right here. You see it?
Yes.
Now all this brown color right here is all Stevens, right?
Hmm.
So that's where the school is. Now, Stevens Elementary is this up here on top. So there's this green area
Yeah.
that's pressed to it. Now, right above there, there's a little square of the brown again, right? That's Stevens again.
Uh-huh.
And then over here, there's this peach colored stuff, right? And then to the left of this peach colored stuff, that's more Stevens.
Okay.
And then down here, under all this white, which is actually Middleton Cross Plains School District, you got some more Stevens.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you look at the way that these attendance map, I mean, that's one example. I could, okay, so on top of that, now Stevens on the bottom here, there's this key that shows you, let me get this back down.
So what we're seeing there is that how students are disconnected, how their communities or neighborhoods are disconnected from the actual location where the school is. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And this is also the middle school that Stevens Elementary, one of the middle schools, the high school that Stevens Elementary feeds into is over here in this blue area. Again, remember there's a lake that we're crossing here. So Stevens Elementary School comes into Senate Middle School, which is right here.
Oh, wow.
So you're crossing you know what I'm saying? like now, so that's one example. But when you look at the way that these neighborhoods are now, one thing, again, going back to the concept of redlining and like what, so what, right? Like what is the point here and why does this matter in terms of redlining? Well, when you look at where housing is, a lot of your, when you go back into that other map and you think about like what, you know, who had access to those neighborhoods right now where there's all these schools, it is the, you know, it's right now it's represented. So if you're by a school, you're most likely, there are 3 schools in Madison that are in neighborhoods that are predominantly BIPOC or folks of color, and that's Mendota Elementary School, which is up here on the north side. It's where I went to elementary school. Lincoln over here on the south, and then on, you know, Leopold. And but aside from that, all where there's a school, if there is a school, it's surrounded by a white neighborhood. And so for folks, there are no school. When I worked in Oakland in a middle school, we could walk, and it was Deep East Oakland. You could walk to every student's house from the school, and we did at the beginning. It was we would bring them backpacks and school supplies and such. but all of the teachers and the support staff and the volunteers and everybody would leave from the school and walk to the students' houses. Whereas here in Madison, this is, I mean, there's, again, some of it gets so specific to Madison that it can be kind of hard to follow. But like this is the lake view. So this is Maple Bluff, this little orange area in the middle that kind of shoots out into the lake. This is a very affluent area. In this school district, the Mendota School District, if you see there's this purple by Sherman Shabazz, that was cut in half because this area where I grew up, there's a, you know, you go back to that map that I was showing you before, this is a predominantly Black area, Black neighborhoods that are out here on the north side, and they split that all the way up just so the Maple Bluff folks didn't have to go to this school, they go to this one over here.
Right.
So, you know, you could keep going. I mean, the way that Emerson is broken up, so you have kids that, you know, busing, but a lot of it, again, going back to this bigger concept of access to democratic processes and institutions, what we're saying is that the history of housing.
So did it go like she wanted it to go?
We had a fluke glitches there, but
Dorcas, you're not on mute. Thank you, Dorcas. Sorry, Justin. While we have a little break there, we have one question where someone's asking if you could clarify why students aren't attending their neighborhood schools.
Because that's they don't have they can't because the boundary, the school district, the school district.
Yeah.
And so you get this thing where, in terms of investment, especially for now, this is half of it. There's another part that I'm going to get to in just a second about volatility, and this is where, again, trying to really bring out that there's this history that had to do with the initial foundations of where people live and where they're located. Right. So there's that. And a lot of that shows up and it manifests in terms of where we are located now, physically. And the next kind of step is showing how it's affecting how people access what I say democratic processes or institutions. One of the main ones, or the commons that many cities share, is their school district, right? But when you think about this, you don't have, and let's say Stevens Elementary School, when you saw that neighborhood was split basically around one square, there was a square in the middle that had a school that on the north border of where that square was is basically a block away from a school, but instead of going to the school that those children could walk to, they have to take a bus to Stevens, which is miles away. Right. And so when you think about having an identity or being able to invest in the sense of families and, you know, all these other things, it has completely, this is a structural impediment for families and for our communities to actually be able to access and invest in the school community. And this is something that is very deliberate. And like I said, Madison presents a very easily accessible presentation of how that's at play because of stuff like that school district thing, right? And I mean, what the school district will say is that they try not to have they don't want to the way they put it is they don't want to overburden any one school with free and reduced students or free and reduced lunch, and so they mix it up. There's some of that's true, but there's some of it that actually doesn't represent that. Also, well, again, it gets into education policy stuff, but I think that concept is not a complete picture either, right? Like that's because people are of lower income. The school I taught I worked at in Oakland was 99.9% extreme poverty. We had one kid whose father was a stevedore. He worked at the doctor's union job, and so that brought that number up. But it was extraordinarily low income. I don't, you know, and I'm sure you guys sounds like you guys are probably of the same thinking, but I don't use the term poor because I feel like that's a qualifier of an individual's character, you know, like of poor quality. It's just that they're lower income, right? So, you know, I try to get people to think about this different. There's some contradictions here in Madison in terms of the racial stuff that this is kind of in here just because. So something that you'll hear in Madison is that folks of color only represent 17% of the population. That's not untrue. But when you look at the school district, it's almost not, I mean, it's over 50%, it's almost 70% folks of color, right, in the school district. So that's your comments. So you're asking, how could this stuff, how could both those things be true? And I was actually, when I was looking at Madison initially, there was some stuff there. And one of the things that we had to look at was this import effect. So Madison has a university that literally imports white people every year.
Right.
And when you look at the yield data of who actually comes to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, it's overwhelmingly white.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I had to do is go and look at vital records and look at who was born here. And when you look at who's born here, you find out that it's closer to 50% folks of color who are born here.
Wow.
But at any given moment, because we're importing white folks, and again, not because they're bad or good or whatever, it's the university, right? The university has this import effect that really changes the way that we think about this. Okay, so moving into this, right, in terms of the history, because the next thing that I'm going to kind of talk through is that in addition to it determining or explaining where people live now, the history of redlining also explains where you have high volatility. And the volatility is a residual effect of the history of housing policies that I think is as pernicious, if not worse, than the initial issue of segregation and all these things, because what it's doing and what it does is that you have a lot of our lowest income neighborhoods that turn over annually. I talked a lot, I talked about those elementary schools. One of them that I looked at with this was Orchard Ridge, which is here. Sorry that I'm jumping around to everybody. That elementary school map is so intense that it's hard to get on a slide and to make sense. But
yeah, it's very telling. So the volatility that you're looking at and you're going to describe to us is why there is so much turnover, evictions, et cetera, predominantly in low-income neighborhoods. And
right.
You're going to explain that for us now, why that happens.
Right. And so this is Orchard Ridge. It's right here. It's this neighborhood.
What color?
This purple, sorry.
Okay.
No, let's see here.
I'm color coded.
No, it's all right. It's all right. So this neighborhood right here, Orchard Ridge, Toki.
Okay.
All right. Now I'm just giving you guys just kind of some reference points here.
That's helpful.
All right, now I'm going to show you one more thing. So, like I said, sorry that I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but
no problem. It's a very complex topic. Is
so where stability matters, and I want to show you what I'm talking about in terms of this map and where I am, because I don't know why this is not all of a sudden. There we go.
Switch your.
So Orchard Ridge is just above on your bottom left. You got Balsam, Russet Road, Allied Drive, and Hammersley, Teresa Terrace neighborhoods. These little red neighborhoods over here on the southwest corridor. Orchard Ridge is kind of right in the middle of there. So one thing that I saw with this neighborhood that I thought when I looked at this is that a lot of our schools, when you looked at their lowest income feeder neighborhoods, the housing was turning over at a clip of over 50% annually. Now, for those of us that are familiar with, especially elementary school education, relationships are key, and continuity in relationships are key. Right. And so, it's not necessarily, it's always problematic to do generalizations and make universal statements, but I will say I would say the majority of the time, if you show me a school where the lowest income neighborhoods turn over annually at over 50%, and you have that type of churn, I don't care if you got, Yoda in the classroom, that school is going to struggle. And I don't need to know much else about the school. I don't need to know a whole lot about the teachers or about any of these other things. When you're having that type of challenge developing relationships. So if something I probably should have started this with is Madison, Wisconsin right now is either in terms of disparities in educational outcomes between its students of color, particularly Black students, and their white counterfactual, it is either the worst or of the worst in the United States.
Oh, wow.
And so there's a lot of data on that. Look at the race to equity report. Look at, if you just kind of look at these things, the disparities are so severe. And something that has been really, well, whether people have really tried to tackle it. And I think the way that a lot of places try to tackle things is through programmatic interventions.
Right.
But when you think about the structure and having these structural impediments in the history of the way that the city is shaped, and then your government, the way that your political boundaries and all these other things happen, you start to get into this. And so the way, we grab the fish where we see the fish instead of accounting for light refraction and recognizing where the fish is, if you will. And so it's a lot easier to say, well, there's this issue in a school, the school is struggling. And so therefore we need to go into the school and fix the school. When I first got out of the military, I was a teacher in San Diego, California, and I was an educator at an alternative school or continuation school, working with some master teachers. And when I ended up in grad school for education policy, my monograph, the idea was wet feet and empty stomachs. And it basically was the same thing. Child's wet feet and empty stomach, I don't care who you have in the school, it's going to be much more difficult to teach them algebra, which is not a novel concept. Many of us that are even vaguely familiar with education policy kind of understand that it is the way it works. So sorry, I'm just trying to get oriented. So you see these things, and then you start saying that the way that we're looking at these disparities is largely due to we're looking at them solely at the site of the school site and not thinking about it in terms of the way that housing affects it. I sat on a committee that was looking at whether or not there should be police officers or educational resource officers, which is such an interesting way to say police in schools, educational resource officers. Here nor there. But a lot of what we saw is that the issues that because there's also, as you could imagine, if that's the case in terms of the disparities, in terms of educational outcomes for our students of color, what you could probably hold is that there's probably the same type of disparities in other categories. And one of the ones, again, that Madison is of the worst in the United States is in the disparities in police contact and arrest between our youth of color and especially at schools. And then you get into this thing about for like infractions. So the same student does the same thing, which one ends up in jail, which one has the different sentences. And so Madison is of the worst, if not the worst, in any given year in the United States in terms of these disparities as well. And again, the way that we think about this is, depending on how you feel about police, you see it as like an interaction that goes on between a child and a police. And then it's either looking at the actions of the child or looking at the actions of the police. And that's our focus of analysis. But when you start thinking about a number of these other things that, again, are residuals of the history of housing patterns and access to housing in a city, this is what I'm saying about bringing it back and saying that the mixtape concept, this is what you're saying. This is the residual effects of a lot of this history. So this turnover, this idea of not having access. So I talked about the educational disparities. The next thing I'm going to get into is this thing about government processes, because and I think this is something that hasn't really been looked at a whole lot. And, hopefully you guys will be able to help me and tell me that actually you wrote the master's thesis on it, and I just haven't been able to find it, which is totally understandable. I think one person maybe read one of my theses, and it wasn't my advisor, I'm pretty sure. I think it was my grandma. But so I totally understand. No, so I'm going to get into this in terms of government structure, because there's another key piece to this where the history of housing and the extant relationships with housing geography and then also housing volatility absolutely affects people's ability to access electoral processes. And this is an interesting thing. I sat for a little bit over 2 years on the task force on government structure for the city of Madison, where we looked at this stuff, and I'm about to be on the redistricting committee for the city of Madison as well, where we're trying to look at this stuff. So this is kind of more of a stat sheet. It's just to think about this, you know, to kind of at least introduce some complexity in terms of how we think about what we mean by these different types of programs and different types of renters and different types of residents. I work, you know, I think I didn't even mention, I don't think in my bio, but my day job is I'm the executive director of a community development organization in Madison, Wisconsin, called Commonwealth. And one thing we, you know, so many things are about language, and I always say that we talk about, instead of saying tenants, a lot of times we'll say residents instead of saying, I don't use the word landlord because I feel like it's very feudal. I use the concept of property owner because I feel like that's more accurate, but we love that term landlord, even though, like I said, it's very feudal. Anyway, all that to say is these are just some concepts in terms of where we're seeing turnover.
Right.
I know that, go ahead.
Yeah, you've got both of your slides showing together. So I think you might want to turn one of them off.
I don't know what. How we doing?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And if you could break down for people what some of your acronyms mean as you go along.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. So I'm just talking again about Section 8 is a program that it's actually, so the biggest part of government that funds housing, HUD does not actually fund a whole lot of housing. The majority of, you know, your Section 8, Section 42, that's all the IRS. That's all tax code. That's all tax information.
Okay.
So Section 8 is a tax identifier for a type of voucher that can go either to a project, so the whole building can have a Section 8 allocation, so everybody in there only pays a third of their income. Even if it's zero, they pay a third of that, everyone in the thing. Or you can have individual vouchers that follow the individual from place to place. And there is, I'm sure you've heard that there's a stigma around Section 8 residents, even though the reality, at least in terms, again, I can speak of the few municipalities, and I always say that like the few municipalities that I've lived in, I can't even account for New York or LA because I feel like there's so much of outliers that they have to be looked at independent of other cities. You know, they have to be looked at differently because they're kind of these global cities, especially, you know, so, but when you look at, you know, my other places are Boston, Chicago a bit, the Bay Area, and then San Diego, California, in addition to
Madison.
Madison, and then New York, LA, and I've spent a brief amount of time not doing housing stuff in New Orleans, but so I just say that my understanding is that because Section 8 housing, Section 8 vouchers can be so hard to come by and people hold on to them, no one wants to lose their voucher if they get it, they tend to be more stable of residents. So it's you know, but when people hear Section 8, a lot of times there's an idea that's evoked about the type of individual who's going to be living somewhere. All right, so the home CDBG, these are programs that are designated through HUD, home funds, and then community development block grant. So these are what they are designations around funding allocations that are the city, the municipality is the custodian of. And they are, when you have a home funded project, it has income restrictions on the units. And so what happens is that you have these entire neighborhoods in Madison that have only, you know, the only way that the housing has been created is through home funds. So that means that they're income restricted. And what that says is that go back to this thing where all you have is very low income housing and then very expensive housing. And so when a family, let's say that the person gets a job and they get that promotion, now they got to move because they can't stay in the unit because now they're already past their income threshold.
Right.
And so you have these built-in destabilizers that stop folks from being able to stay in a place. And it's not like they can just move to the unit next door, they can move across the street. They have to move all the way across town, or they have to move. And it's all the way, starting from 30% of the what's called the area median income up to 60%. But if your unit that you're in is a 30% unit or a 50% unit, and so that's the income limit, if you increase your income, you have to move you can't stay in that unit, even if, and you have these entire neighborhoods where everything in the neighborhood is nothing but income restricted housing or very expensive housing. And so again, that is a very much a structural destabilizer that prevents people from actually being there. And kind of the reason that I have this here is because when we go back into that question or the concept of children turning over at a school, when you have these built-in, again, this stuff is baked into the actual housing stock in neighborhoods that are very, that's so very much is an impediment to people accessing stuff.
And that's determined by local policy, those decisions, right?
Well,
Where it's neighborhoods and such.
Yes, it's determined by so local policy, and it's again going back to this thing about where people were allowed to live, and what, you know what I mean. So the neighborhoods that are on the isthmus that are close to the schools, those things are mostly single family home neighborhoods. There is not density. There is no you don't have mixed use. You're not going to see mixed income housing. It's all middle upper class housing like around the school, and so you're talking about these.
But it's the city or the county or the state that is.
Yes, historically, it's been a cumulative effect, right? It's been a culmination of many, many decades of housing practices at the local level, but then it's reinforced by the restrictions and the contingencies of federal policy. Right. So again, it's kind of a very layered mix of this stuff. Now, this point about mobility, and this is, I think a key point, is that if the mobility is the wrong concept here. I meant volatility, but if the volatility is driven or rooted by historic segregation, historic land use policy and density restrictions. So density restrictions is a big thing. As many people know, the racial restricted covenants were they were made illegal by the Supreme Court in 1948. From 1940, I saw there's good evidence of this in Madison. There's good evidence in Detroit and St. Louis, some in Chicago. What happened is that from 1940 to 1960, you needed a state statute to do this. But what they started doing is putting deed restrictions on land that instead of saying, well, you can't live here if you phenotypically are presenting or identify as Black, what they said is that we are going to put a density restriction on the deed. So the only type of housing that can go here is single family homes, so you cannot build multifamily housing. Now, if you insert the issues of access to capital, that in the discrimination that folks are facing in terms of accessing loans to actually buy homes, including after the GI Bill after World War II, what they did is a de facto way of reinforcing the racial restricted covenants that were struck down by the Supreme Court. And there's ample, throughout the west side of Madison, there's, again, this is more of the gentrification thing. I think I'll add it to this. But when you look at that and you get into how that explains the limitations of the type of housing in a lot of the neighborhoods, it's very real, right? And so what I'm saying here is that in essence, this land use policy and then the turnover because of the income restrictions, this is a de facto form of a barrier to participate in democratic processes and institutions. Now, technically, one might argue that that's illegal under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, but you know, this is America. That doesn't always matter. So, so here we are. There's a number of things that feed into volatility in addition to all the stuff that we talked about. Evictions are one way, but there's a number of things that we talked about. One reason that I focus on this and I try to distinguish this is that evictions, and Matt Desmond's book is phenomenal. I hope everyone should read that and check out, at least, look at the pictures. No, it's a really great analysis and survey of the importance of evictions. And I do think that it's a huge thing in housing policy to think about. I focus on volatility because evictions is a type of volatility, but there are a number of things, as we discussed, in terms of access, people get non-renewed. If you have to, in essence, you get incomed out of a unit, you also are contributing to this volatility. So evictions are a way. I think it's important that we're thinking about evictions under the broader umbrella of housing volatility or volatility in housing tenure. And, then seeing evictions as part of that. All right. So I'm gonna, this is this last thing, and this is, I helped author the executive report. If you guys are really interested in this stuff, or you're in and around Madison, or it isn't just Madison. And this is the thing, is that I don't know that a lot of people really think about the way the municipal government is structured and the role of things like neighborhood associations and all these things, and either as being activists or potential activism, or if you look at it as ways to actually reinforce a lot of the existing or the pernicious policies that have been there for forever. So Madison, Wisconsin has an unusually large city council. We have 20 city council members. So if you just think about that in terms of your respective city, San Diego, I believe, has 9 for 1.7 million people. Wow. Now it's interesting because the argument is that, well, if you have the big council, there's more opportunities for people to be, invested in and involved, and that will happen. We have a board, committee, and commission structure where there are over 104 standing boards, commissions, and committees, and all populated by residents. Now, again, a lot of people will say, well, isn't that a good thing, right? Because you have a lot of opportunities for people to be involved. And I guess as a rhetorical device, sure. But in reality, when we looked at this over the last 50 years, we found that these boards, commissions, and committees were overwhelmingly represented by 4 aldermanic districts. So you have 4 geographic areas all represented disproportionately by your more affluent populations who have made all the decisions. There was a point in the 90s where the entire school board lived in 1 aldermanic district because the school board here is done at large. And so again, the geography that has access, the geography determines the history of access and influence in terms of the policies that you were talking about that determine where different types of housing go, where different investments are made in terms of economic development. And so the people who are making these are disproportionately represented by neighborhoods that historically excluded access to people, excluded people of color from accessing them by way of historic redlining and restrictive covenants. So again, going back to this thing about what redlining and the kind of the mixtape concept is, it wasn't just about, it's the history of that meant that the people who had access to the bodies of government that are making decisions at the Plan Commission, the all your urban design commission, your public works, your park, all of these things are disproportionately represented by very strict geographies. Now, in addition, and again, I apologize to do this. This maps, they don't do well on. They do not do well on slides always, or at least I'm not savvy enough with PowerPoint to make them make sense.
Okay. It's still helpful to have a visual with this. Oh, that's a good one. That's quite bright, clear.
See this one?
Yeah.
So one thing I want to show you
Bigger
first.
though, that would be good too.
Yeah, I will do that.
Okay,
Okay, so this is what I was saying. Now let me get this
and
bigger.
the BCC means what? Boards, committees, and commissions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
And so what you see again, remember the geography of Madison, and remember those early maps about where people live. And what you find is that all of your boards, commissions, and committee members are represented by this downtown area. And then another thing that we looked at is that where you have boards, commissions, committees, city staff, then it's all represented by the downtown area. And then when you look at the number of boards, commissions, and committees that older people or city council folks serve on, so there's not, it's not like it's uniform. So this is what this is. So the 4th district, which is right here in downtown, a heart of south of the capital, so not the student section, but the affluent Mansion district over here, that alder is on 15 committees.
wow.
And then when you looked at like the Public Works Plan Commission, all the ones that we called lead committees, meaning they have power de facto approval outside of the city council by statute, they're overwhelmingly represented by your more affluent neighborhoods. So you have a situation where, again, the history of housing and the history of segregation and where people have lived determines and has determined who has had access to influence and decision-making around the future of things and in contemporary practice. Now, this is one thing. Now, the map that I wanted to show you is that when you have 20, the number of people on the city council isn't as important as the districts themselves. And what I'm about to show you, so this is a map. Now, I don't know if you can see this, these Park Edge, Park Ridge. Do you guys see this? Okay, like the little blue lettering. What those are, if you remember, I showed you the map of the bright, it was that blue map with the bright red neighborhoods. And I explained that that actually is, it creates a crescent around the outside of Madison.
Right.
That actually was determining where folks of color live. Now let's look at this Hammersley, Teresa. So basically, and I'm going to do this really fast. So in District 19 and 20, or 20 and 1, I mean, this is one neighborhood here. So let me get in here. One neighborhood is in 3 different aldermanic districts. So you can't, and Park Edge, Park Ridge, right? This neighborhood, it's right here in this little blue area.
Okay.
So if you were to organize the people in one complex, it splits them up. So there is no political constituency of color in that aldermanic district. Now, if you move from there to Balsam Russet, you cannot be on the city council. And if you move from Balsam Russet to Allied Drive, you also can't be on the city council. And remember, because you have to live in the district that you represent. So going back to the conversations of volatility and housing volatility, and so when you think about collective action and actually having political constituency of folks of color, the way that the aldermanic districts are broken down absolutely prevents that access. And so these neighborhoods, there is no way to do collective action across your neighborhoods of color in terms of electoral politics or in terms of actually getting into these boards, commissions, and committees. On the north side, it works the same way. I mean, there's parts of the north side of Madison that actually are predominantly folks of color that are not represented by NRT focus areas. But basically, if you move from Brentwood, this neighborhood up here in District 12, if you move from there across Warner Park, so if you just cross the park and you go into whatever that's called now, I mean, it used to be the North Glen and all these things, you can't be an alder. And if you move from there to Northport Apartments, which is down the street, can't be an alder. You move from there to Truax, you can't be an alder. So basically what it's saying is that the nature of these districts, the small size of these districts, combined with that mobility or volatility that I'm talking about, prevents people from actually participating in electoral politics and having any type of what would be called formal political power or access to political power. And this is again, you have a situation, it's kind of an aldermanic gerrymandering in a way, but basically the way that the aldermanic districts are set up is that there is no way for a political constituency of color to exist in any aldermanic district. And so go ahead.
Let me make sure I've got this. So in effect, in this instance, the alderman boundaries, the boundaries to be an alderman, are excluding those neighborhoods, those low-income neighborhoods. Is that the gist here?
Right.
Okay.
Well,
So
they break them up. They break them up so that they're always a structural minority, even though if you just change the way you looked at it, there is no aldermanic district that has a political constituency that is majority or even close of folks of color. And even when it gets close, District 14 is the closest one. When you break that down by income distribution, again, you have zero actual political access or political power or mobilizing access amongst your lowest income folks of color in Madison, Wisconsin. Right. And that's by structure.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And so when you think about the ways that people would advise folks to take action, or how do you actually go out and change this? If this is the way that housing policy is existing today, how do you change it? Well, you can't, because even, you know what I mean? Because you don't have enough of a political constituency in any aldermanic district to actually mobilize. And the example of Park Edge, Park Ridge, where literally the one complex of apartment buildings, of all folks of color, is broken up into 3 aldermanic districts. And so even in that situation, you couldn't even take advantage of having a concentration of people because of the way it's broken down. And if you go back and you think about the way that actually speaks to the story of the school district, that's also very, it's the same thing you're seeing, right? Is that by these political geographies, it's in essence excluding people from access. So in summary, it's really important for us to understand the history and how that works. But also it's really important for us to understand how that is influencing the things today. And in the case of this aldermanic and boards, commissions, and committees, that the history of housing actually spoke to and can explain how people were able to or not able to be part of boards, commissions, and committees, or how they were not able to be to access those electoral processes that could otherwise mitigate the history, the history or the residuals of the more pathological effects of the history of the housing policies. And it also kind of explains a little bit. So, all right. So that's a little bit longer than I really wanted to do. I know there was some of that was kind of choppy, and in a way, it's kind of a hip bone connected to the leg bone. But I definitely would love to hear any comments or questions.
Okay, so we're gonna open it up now. And okay, I've got a hand up. And I can see her hand. This is my sister. I never see her hand, but I see it today. Regina, you have a question or a comment for Justice. Thank you, Justice. This is very.
I just have a comment. Thank you so much. And what you ended with, this whole description of the structure of the task forces, it just makes it so clear why it's so necessary for us to have white co-conspirators, because they can get in those positions that people of color in the other neighborhoods can't get into, and they can begin to make those changes. So thank you for just a beautiful example of why we really need to work together.
Definitely, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so raise your hand in the participant thing. I think most of you know how to do that. Oh, Dave and Bernie, come on. There you go.
Hi, just one comment on the slides and the maps and all. I use the print screen button to take a little picture of whatever, I use Google Maps a lot. You could take pictures that way. You use the print screen and then any kind of a graphic, program, you could superimpose these maps and have a transition so that you could kind of see the first one against the next one to see how these different maps are not, they are not gelling together, so they break up communities.
Mm.
And I know that for Baha'i communities too, the way many municipalities are set up, there will be several small districts all around a central district, and it's very hard for Baha'is to form spiritual assemblies because a lot of times the new people getting in, the only housing, white, black, whatever you are, the only housing is maybe on those peripheral districts. So new people coming into community end up not in the city, but in these peripheral districts. So it shows how the planning has been very poor from the get-go.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Yeah, and Justice doesn't know this, of course, but Baha'i communities, our administrative districts currently follow existing municipalities. So that's what Dave's reference is to, yeah. And I understand we are looking at coming up with our own way of doing it, you know, because you can have an institution, you know, right here and then nothing, you know, again, because of that, the history, as you say, you know, the geographic history of mapping and areas. I found this very, very insightful, and it makes me think about our efforts at community building work and what we see, you know, when we work in neighborhoods. We see this very thing, that volatility that you spoke of, you know, the turnover. And it's so, you know, you start working with a family and, you know, the kids and the youth, and you develop these great relationships, and then boom, they're moving, you know, again. And also the income, I thought it was very, very important. Something I've kind of been tinkering with in the back of my mind, but you really laid it out about incoming out of an area, right? You know, you start making some progress and then boom, you can't stay there anymore. So where does that put you? That puts you into a higher income neighborhood, and you're struggling again because you probably really can't afford to be there yet, just because you've gotten off of, you know, that percentage cutoff. Bob, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, appreciate very much the comments tonight. Well, one comment and a question. The comment is, I thought Madison was a hotbed of liberalism, and that they had a case studies of all good progressive qualities, and you wouldn't have these problems in such a progressive place. Obviously, that's not the case. And same with Minneapolis. You know, we have all this image of some of these cities as being really in the forefront of doing interesting things, but they've got as many problems as the rest of the cities. So my question is, where are the courts in this whole thing? It just seems like some of this stuff is just wrong and illegal and unethical. And where are the courts in this situation?
So one of the challenges that Wisconsin has is that we've had, well, first thing is I'll say Madison, Minneapolis, they're Democratic cities, but I don't know that necessarily means anything other than that they vote blue. But, you know, Malcolm X, I think a lot of people, I mean, a lot of his work was in the North. It wasn't in the South. And when you look at the worst places in terms of disparities in the United States, where you're talking about San Francisco, Detroit, Seattle, Minneapolis, Madison, Wisconsin, Boston, none of these are in the South at all. Mm-hmm. They're all in the North, and they're all in these very blue enclaves. Now, one thing that I'm doing here is I'm using a model that I'm suggesting that the disparities are moderated by race and race alone. It doesn't mean that in the other places there are not the disparities, but they're moderated to more of a degree by income than by race. And so that is what determines the outcomes. And that is what actually can explain the disparities, is whether or not people have money or not. And then obviously there still are issues of race. But what I'm saying is that especially in Madison, Wisconsin, the moderator is race alone. One of the biggest disparities we had, categories of disparities that we have in Madison is not between just white and black. It's between wealthy black students whose parents have high incomes and high education and high levels of involvement, and their white counterparts. That's where your huge disparity is, because in many places that high income and so that creates another type of thing here, because you kind of get this, everyone starts to think about their own interests. And it's like, look at, even if you're here and I'm, if someone's Latinx and I work at the university, and Madison has always been good for folks of color who come here. It's just not, it doesn't treat its children who are born here very well, I guess is the way to put that. And a lot of that is done that way. Now, the courts thing, one of the challenges is that Wisconsin, it has a really interesting history of legislation. It's a very conservative state. I think it's one of the things that make a lot of the work around the structure of government and everything is because it's like, all right, so you got to find a counterfactual that in a city that's better. And it's like, well, man, that's easy because everywhere in the United States is better. So I could just pick a city and I already have a counterfactual, one of the things here is that the courts here and the Supreme Court here it has historically been very conservative. And so the legislature and the Supreme Court at state level have been historically very conservative. Now, Madison and Dane County, again, they vote Democratic in general, but I don't know that growing up here, I don't remember the whole part about it being progressive. I remember where I was in this thing called the Dane County Multicultural Teen Council, and we were going to go to Sun Prairie, which is right outside of Madison, to do skits. And this was circa 97 about interracial dialogue, discussion, and relationships. And we had 370 kids get excused from school so they didn't have to take part in that conversation. Lodi is in the same county, and when we were told that they could not guarantee our safety having conversations like that. And this is 1997. So I don't remember, when I hear folks talking about that, about both cities, I often think that they're talking about the university campuses and not the cities. But so to answer your question strictly though, is I think a lot of this, it has to be brought to the courts, but I think a challenge that we're still having in terms of mobilizing and mobility and collective action has to do with this kind of forced volatility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, Mayron and Rick have a question, and I have 2 questions in the chat. Mayron and Rick, why don't you go ahead, and then we'll hear from Allison and then Britt. And I'll invite them to ask their question, or I can read it for them if they prefer not to. Mayron and Rick from South Dakota.
We're in a small town, and this isn't a question. I just wanted to share what a friend of mine found here going on. It's that the county assessor is assessing high-valued properties owned by people who have money, which is virtually all, they're going to be higher income and wealth is going to be white folks, okay? And they're assessing the properties at 50%, 55% of the market value of these properties. This is homes, etc.
Wow.
But lower value properties like $50,000, $25,000, these are assessed at their market value or 50%, up to 50% above their market value. And the lowest cost ones are the most commonly rented out by the lower income people. And then the the rental rates have to be high to cover those taxes. And then therefore it's even creating even a higher volatility that you're talking about. And so this says you've got to go into the assessor's offices and start comparing high and low value properties in your local community and find out how they are being assessed, because then they're sucking the money out of the poor people to cover their housing costs, to cover the county costs. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, yes. And, you know, like I said, hopefully, for folks who are looking at this stuff in other places, there's hopefully, I mean, this is something that maybe someone wants to send me some feedback, because I think it's absolutely right. And you're seeing different parts of this happening in many different places and many different manifestations.
Yeah. Thank you, Mayron and Rick. Okay, Allison, do you want to ask your question, Allison? If you do, come on, or else I can read it from the chat. I'll give you a second to.
Sure. I'll say my question because
Okay.
I think I want to expand it on it a little bit.
Sure.
With these ingrained patterns throughout cities around the country, what can we do as citizens to prevent the outcomes that we're seeing in terms of crime and people of color having less advantage? And I'm assuming that when you were in the bio where it was talking about outcomes and trauma and crime, that you're associating those things with neighborhoods where people have less access and less privilege. So it's going to take a lot of ingenuity and creativity and changes in power to have any change in this redlining to go away. So in the meantime, what can we do to reverse some of these trends?
Okay, so a lot there, right? Like there's a lot there. I think one thing, you know, with, you know, making sure that we have a lot of this information. Excuse me. Oh. That we have a lot of this information, we're getting a better grasp on the complexities about it, right? I think so. For instance, in Madison, you know, knowing how this all works, there's this big issue with children stealing cars. It's been a kind of a big thing. It's not, Madison is the only place that happens, but it's a big concern. One of the things that's unique, Madison doesn't have a culture of chopping, meaning it's not like we have chop shops where people are stealing cars and chopping them. We have very young adolescents who are stealing cars and joyriding, and then they're just crashing the car or just ditching it or something. And so it's this huge issue with the police. And you know, in the winter here, people have a tendency to leave their car running. You know, they start it up and then they go inside and they do whatever, and then they come back and hopefully, you know, the car is warm. Instead, the car is gone. But the cars are getting recovered, and so there's this joyriding thing that's going on. Again, the gentrification thing. I have another map that shows, and I appreciate the comments about the map and the slide. The thing is that some of these, because of their level of detail in terms of pixelation, they lose their integrity. And so you can't zoom in at that level when you have it as a copy right off the print screen and you put it onto the slide. It's harder to zoom in and maintain the pixelation in terms of the integrity. But I hear what you're saying about, you know, trying to figure this out. It's one of those things about Zoom that makes it the in-person thing. It's a lot easier when you have a presentation and you can just kind of go from slide to slide or from page to page. In any case, one of the things that's on the other map is a transit map. And so this peripheralization, one of the things that it did, so to get from the north side of Madison to the west side of Madison on public transit takes 2.5 hours. Now in an automobile, it's about 15 to 23 minutes. But to get across that same space takes over 2.5 hours on public transit. It is horrible. Those neighborhoods that are peripheralized, as you could imagine, it's not enough. Like I said, there's other stuff that we can go into about where employment is, where jobs are, where, you know, where all these things are. And as you could imagine, the neighborhoods that are at the periphery do not have access to transit, I mean, Madison does have a number of really great public parks. But in terms of employment and all these other things, it's ridiculous. So all that to say, there's this huge issue with these. And now where it's happening is remember the part about where you have very low income housing and then very wealthy housing. So there, you know, you have a lot of affluent neighborhoods who are very concerned about the rise in car thefts, and there's kind of an all hands on deck attitude about it. Now I'm facilitating the police department. They have a new police chief, you give people the benefit of the doubt. And so they wanted to have a youth board, advisory board. They asked me to facilitate it. I said it has to be anonymous, et cetera, et cetera. So I sit in on it. But one thing that the youth showed them is that when you look at where you have high rates of car thefts, it's where the transit is the worst. And when you kind of put that together with the fact that no one's stealing these cars and selling them, they're literally, kids are stealing cars to go through the drive-through at McDonald's, and then after they go through the drive-through, they drive them to the mall and then leave the car in the parking lot, or go through like a joyriding thing at the mall and then evade the police and then leave them there. So you have this thing where like, but to get to the same mall, and in this case, I mean, this is something again that I have to get back to the maps, but you're talking about going less than a mile and a half. A distance of less than a mile and a half. But when you showed the police chief that for a child to take the bus to that same McDonald's or the same mall, that will take them upwards of an hour. So it's not, anyway, stealing cars is not okay. I'm not saying that, but understanding these correlations between the ways that the neighborhood are segregated and why there's, in terms of the rationale for different actions, that's a huge thing, right? And so like, now it's like, all right, chief, you say you want to be a different kind of chief than we hear that because police, whatever. What we need from the police chief, and speaking of allyship, is that like, it's not about how do we get people to stop stealing cars. How do we get the police chief to start leveraging his position to go out and influence policy around transit? Because if you're the police chief and you're saying you want to see this go down, then what I want to see you doing is lobbying the city council. I want to see you lobbying Metro to change their routes. And I want that to come from the police chief. And I want them in there, so when they're doing their budget things, to say that in order to change this, you can have a bunch of programs that are trying to like tell kids not to steal cars, or you could change it so kids can just take the bus. So I don't know. I mean, it was kind of a convoluted answer. I mean, it's a very complex question, right? But there are a lot of things. I mean, there's another thing I talk about with ICE. I mean, the service provision thing with the neighborhoods. If you think about what it means to be in a place that was historically isolated and alienated from all of these things and what that means to folks, I always say, and then you show up with a program, there's these proverbial ICE salesmen. And what I mean by that is that like, someone gets, punched in the eye, and then the person that punched them shows up the next day saying, hey, I heard you're looking for some ice and I got the best ice. I don't know that you're empowering me at that point, right? Like what you're doing is you're coming in there and trying to mitigate this infraction that you've laid upon me with your ice, So I'm sorry if that was, there's a lot to your question. Again, we could talk about different parts of that and the ways that you're seeing. I mean, there's a number of studies and there's a lot of good data that speaks to the relationship with children moving and volatility in general. I know the adverse community experiences test, one of the things that it looks at is how many times a child has moved before they're 18. And then a subset of that is how many times they moved in prepubescence. And so how often is this child moving and from place to place, and do they ever have a sense of stability? Because that's really critical in terms of that kind of hierarchy of needs. So there's a lot of things, Allison, that that we could keep getting into in terms of the way that this type of segregation and displacement influences different behaviors, and how those behaviors can be then pathologized or criminalized. And so in essence, I mean, I did another thing with DUIs. Like DUIs are a function of driving and alcohol, but when you looked at where folks of color live, and then you look, and again, I'm not saying alcohol is good or bad. I'm just saying that it is the case that sometimes people, when they're either hanging out and socializing with their friends, or let's say they want to go on a date. And I did this again for the mayor. And I said, if I were to want to, I was courting somebody and we decided that we wanted to go out on a date and have a drink with dinner. I'm talking about adults. If you grabbed a random person and they, a person of color in Madison, and you looked at the distance between where I live and where I'm going to be able to have that date versus any random white folks, it's completely different. And then is there access to public transit to go on a date? And so something that, going on a date and having a drink. But now if you say, well, okay, but in order to do that, you're gonna have to drive 20 minutes on a freeway, then the likelihood of having a mixture of alcohol consumption and driving is increased. Again, somewhat influenced by the history of housing segregation. So there's a number of ways that you can kind of tie all this stuff in. And I think it's really important that we're thinking that way, right? And moving beyond kind of the individual level associations of crime. So thank you. That was, like I said, that was a really thought-provoking question.
That was really a packed answer. Thank you. There was so much in there that was so enlightening, Justice. Yeah, and always with this series, we really start getting good after the presentation. That's when people are really warmed up. They've been mentally massaging the information, and we're just going to go for it. We have a few more hands up, so let me just let people know where they are and let Justice know where we are as well. So Allison, or I'm sorry, Britt, let me know, come up if you'd like to put your question out verbally. If not, I'll read it from the chat. And then following you, we have Jean Wright and then Van Gilmer.
Hi, Sherilyn. It's me, Britt. And thank
Okay,
you so much,
can you bring your, can you get a little louder, please?
Sure. Is that better?
Great. Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Justice. It was a really fantastic presentation. And I think that you already partially answered my question when you were addressing Allison's question. So, I noticed you talked about lobbying our Metro Council members, but my question is really primarily for those of us who do live in equitable cities. I live currently in Louisville, Kentucky, and so much of what you said is just so relevant. Almost every single thing that you said is so relevant in our city too. My question originally was just what is the most effective ways that normal citizens who become aware that we live in incredibly inequitable cities can take action to address structural inequities. The programs that my city is putting in place are great, but they're not really deconstructing the structural issues, as you pointed out. And so I know that there's a lot of lobbying campaigns to our Metro Council members. I don't know if there's anything else that you can recommend.
Well, it's interesting, there's a advisor of mine once said that at the end of any book, you always have to, even though you have to come up with a neat, 5 quick solutions, and never mind the fact that I just described a whole, series of challenges that are, infinitely complex. I think, the things you're saying, I think, are where we are kind of left, right? We have to continue the advocacy. I think continuing to understand this stuff and understand the nuances and to really be thinking about it when you're hearing conversations about crime, when you're hearing conversations about the pathologizing of our communities and our people, is to really think about how this stuff works. And the government structure thing, it's something I had never thought about until I was asked to appointed by the mayor and the city council as a joint appointee to that committee. And Eileen Harrington is a brilliant individual who chaired that. She was the head of the SBA in DC for 30 years until she retired, and she's just a phenomenal thinker, and she did masterful work. I think allowing ourselves, what's the thing is that I'm wrong about everything. It's, it's not like I'm lying. It's just that I am coming with inaccurate and incomplete information because it's all I know right now. And so having the humility to understand that in Oakland, there was part of this group, it was all folks of color. And we were talking about how we should be engaging with concepts of white privilege, even though all of us are of color, right? And it was, predominantly Latinx and Black folks. And we really started, I wrote this thing, everyone has a poem and everybody has a price. And the trick and the treasure sometimes can be finding the humility so that we can be honest with one another. And maybe most importantly, honest with ourselves about both and either. And really recognizing that we have to understand this to the degree we can, but then we also have to have the ability to understand when it bends and shifts, right? And to understand that if everyone is focusing on these things, well, what are we thinking about? One thing with Madison, with these disparities, the kind of the ontological or ideological framing that I noticed when I was working for the mayor is that basically the question that everyone wanted to ask and grapple with was like, why are people, and the way that they put it, like, why are people poor? And then you get this host of answers. So it's because they're lazy, because of historic racism, because, you know, and those answers are going to give you different policy solutions and everything else. But I think finding the space to pause and really think about this, which is like, instead of saying, why are people going there, everyone grapple with that. How about we think about this? Does being low income have to make you sick? And how about let's address that? And so and then that gives you a whole new set of answers, a whole new set of frameworks, a whole new other thing. So I think in addition to everything you're saying is allow ourselves to work in community with one another, and allow yourselves, no matter how confident you are with information, allow yourselves to be humble enough so that you can learn from one another as we go forward, because the fight, or, you know, the struggle or whatever it is, it's fluid and it's changing. It's never static. It's never sclerotic or in place. So that's a really great question.
We appreciate it.
Thank you, Britt. Thank you, Justice. Okay, Jean Wright. Hi, Jean.
Okay, I want to say hi to Rick and Mayron. Long time no see.
Okay.
But and anybody else I know on here. But what has been interesting me lately is the backlash we've been experiencing since the murder of George Floyd and the protests and people coming out and saying this is not fair. There has been a backlash against Hannah Nicole Smith's 1619 project. They've said some awful things about her not being able to get the tenure at I think it's North Carolina University. And hearing people say Black folks are lazy, no account, blah, 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 which is ridiculous because we work harder because we have to. And then a lot of these groups like, you know, the Keanu and Boo Boys and whoever those people are afraid that if we get justice and equity, then we will be taking something away from them. And that's just not true. To get equality and justice for yourself, we don't want to take anyone from anybody. We just want to change the system so that everybody has an equal opportunity to get wealth and happiness and educate their kids and so on. So I'm wondering, what do you think about this? Because, you know, you talk about Madison and the committees and things like that. I like what you said about if you want to be our ally, you know, get into positions where you can help us change things, you know. But I'm wondering, what do you think about the backlash against people like you telling the truth and people like Hannah Nicole Smith basically telling the truth about our history?
Thank you, Jean. Before Justice answers that, I just want to let our participants know that he's got to leave in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So we've got, Van is up, and hopefully we can get one more question in before he goes. But if you have a question, put the question out, because Justice's time is short. So thank you. Please go ahead, Justice. Thank you, Jean.
Yeah, and email, you know, and I can, you know, we can continue this. You know, the conversation is a continuum. It starts when you meet and it ends when we pass on to the next one, you know, so it's everything in between. So I think first thing is the dying mule kicks the hardest. And for one thing. And I'm gonna channel that Malcolm X again, and not, you know, for just because it's like the odds are always against us. That's what they tell us all, you know, the odds are always against us, but the truth is on our side, right? And if we have the truth now, something, you know, there's two things here. I have a great aunt who died, you know, she spent her 105th birthday at the same time that I was spending my 30th. I won't say how many years ago that was, but it was a few years ago. She has since passed. But she was into Obama, you know, and her, you know, her body was 105, but her mind was sharp, you know, and she could chat. And I was like, you know, if you remember when he got elected and all that stuff and whatever about him and this thing or that thing, but like there was all this backlash there, right? And all, you know, rose up and it's continuing. And I consider the character who's occupied the White House for between the previous administration, I consider that character a continuum of that backlash. There was a lot of it was rooted just straight up racism, right? Like a lot of it, right? And I was like, you know, and I was like, it feels really heavy. And she said to me, she said, Mijo, she said her whole life has been the end of the world. And she was like, she was born, and then there was World War I, that was going to be the end. And then the Depression, the stock, that was definitely going to be the end. And then World War II was like this imminent, that was the end. And then the Cold War, that was always going to be the end. And the Vietnam, you know, and she said, you know, it's been kind of anticlimactic. Because I would have, you know, and so like, and then the next thing is that she said, you know, for some of us for millennia, but some of us for at least, you know, hundreds of years, they have been trying to kill us, right? Like not like passively, not like kind of, but like legitimately trying to kill us. And whether it's putting us in cages, denying us access, you know, housing in poor and squalor. And we just got done having an amazing conversation. And the reason I have a dinner to celebrate someone's some aging going on, you know, so and we're gonna eat tonight and we're gonna tell some good jokes. And we're here and we're having this conversation. So, and I pardon the language, but somewhere they gotta be pissed because we're, you know, like we're still here. And like, we're going to keep going and the odds are against us and the truth is on our side. And I don't know that there's another way, you know, they're going to, and that dying mule kicks the hardest, you know, of course they are. Of course they are. You know, of course that's what they're going to do. Right. And they're going to change the goalposts. I mean, before, the reason that they could legitimately deny us access to economy was because they denied us access to education. So now that you have more women than men in grad school, and you have more folks of color going to college than ever before, all of a sudden, what's the thing? Oh, well, education is not that important anymore. Well, that's interesting. That's convenient. You know what I'm saying? Like, right. Now that we're over here and we're over here taking over the thing, now you're like, yo, that's not as big of a deal. So, you know, I would just say, you know, like I said, millennia, 400 years, and we're still here. We just had an amazing time. You guys are amazing folks. You guys are doing this, right? You guys are here having these conversations.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Justice. Can you take one more, Justice?
Yeah, I have a couple more. I'll try and be brief in my answers.
All right, great. Van?
Yes, Justice, as you were describing Milwaukee, it made me think about the area that's north of Chicago, the North Chicago area. It's an area that is practically all white, all affluent, and the schools have no Black students, no Black teachers. There's a community of people who seem to be recognizing that, but the answer to it is something far deeper, and I don't know what that answer is. I mean, I've heard others ask, what are the actions that can be taken? This redlining was intentional, and it started very early. And so all of the area above Chicago, there's no intention of it to have people of color. And so all the people of color are on the South Side. And they're like you've already described. And I'm wondering if you know any areas like this that have made some progress in either welcoming or beginning to have something that attracts the people who are not there. And the people who are not there are the people of color. In our area, it would be the people of color who don't have much money. But there are people of color who have money, and they don't come either. So it's an American problem. But I'm wondering if you've seen anything happening in any areas where this is beginning to change. And if you have, how is it changing? How are they beginning to make it change?
So it's an interesting question. You know, unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of amazing success because the truth is that a lot of people are grappling with this. This is a real thing. It's temporary. However, one thing that we are seeing is people learning how to create democratic wealth generation in areas that have otherwise been seen as politically dispossessed or disconnected. And so there's a number of things. What I said about capturing the money that's going, the resources that go into these places and making it stick, that is a very real thing, right? And so what people are, the Bronx Community Development Initiative is in the Bronx, that's doing some phenomenal work. University community. Again, none of these things, and some of us might be familiar with some of them, and they're not perfect by any means, but they are working to this. The University Circle project in Cleveland is great. What they're trying to do in the Wilbur Corridor in Detroit, I think is great. The Buffalo, what's it called in Buffalo? The Push Buffalo is great. The Action Jack, the work in Jackson, Mississippi, I'm trying to think about what that work is. They're doing the same thing. I think there's some really great work going on that's been funded by the Healthy Communities thing at the California Endowment in Oakland around the Brotherhood of Elders, and where they're trying to do a lot of the same things. So there are, Eastlake is an interesting project. You're familiar with Atlanta. So there are a number of projects that are making inroads. There's some really great stuff. Just thinking about this in Oahu, Hawaii, with the Mound Farms. If you get out of a lot of the activism that's going on the Pine Ridge Reservation and the Dakota Reservation, and over there in the Dakotas, I think, there's a number of these things that are happening, and they're taking pieces of this thing, and they're saying, again, all we have is time. All we have is time and the truth. And so, like, we're just going to start, and we're going to keep pushing, and we're going to start repatriating and taking back the economic capacity of our areas, and not. I don't know that, for instance, the neighborhoods that I was talking about in Madison, that we're ever going to see the type of actual mitigation, because what we're talking about in that point, at pure point, is reparations, right? And repatriation. I mean, we started this thing with an acknowledgement of our indigenous brothers and sisters and their ancestors and their blood and everything else. That's what we're talking about. Now, I don't know that happens. I'll be honest, like I'm a critical optimist. I approach everything with critical hope, but I don't know that we're ever going to get, even the folks who are the allies are ever going to be like, yes, let's give it back. But, maybe, let's keep it out there. Let's keep that thing. But as long as they're not, then that's fine. Let's take back what we got, and let's start repatriating the resources and the collective action and the things in our areas.
Thank you.
So I could probably do one more, and then the rest
Okay.
folks can shoot them.
All right. Does anyone have a last question? Otherwise, I'm going to take it. Anybody else? Okay. I have a question. Well, actually, two, maybe three. One is, let's continue the conversation with you. We would love that. It's been so informative, and this is just such a tangle. It's a morass, I mean, and, that's why I was so excited about you talking about this, because I think it's one of the best examples of what structural racism is, or systemic racism, because it just touches every aspect of life. And it really helps us get a much deeper understanding of how, just how intractable it can be, and how difficult the work is. But continuing the conversation, establishing a new co-conspirator, conspirators, what have you, is very, very important. My question to you is kind of a personal one. And I'd like to know if you would be willing to share a little bit about your personal experience here in Madison as a Chicano, as a man, and as someone who has come back to this community to reclaim what it didn't give him and make it a better place.
Easy question for last. No, I felt, I didn't do bio stuff. I barely made it out of this town. I was charged with a felony when I was 18 years old, and it was dismissed by the skin of my teeth. And I ended up, I was running, and a lot of us are running.
Yeah.
And especially, the kids, and I ended up in the military, which is in and of itself a problem. It can be very problematic unto itself. Its history is not one of benevolence, let's just say. And I was in the Supreme Court of all that. Huey Newton has this line in his book that most people don't think about prison as the first place that I ever found freedom. I'm sorry. Most people don't think of prison as a place to find freedom, but it was the first place that I ever found mine. And the military was very much that for me. I went into, I was very influenced. I was fortunate. My father is, I mean, I didn't know him until I was a little bit older in my life, but he is a musician, and I was surrounded by the arts. And in a university town, you're surrounded by the arts, you're surrounded by academics. And so in a way, my grandmother was one of the first people on record. She would never call herself or consider herself a Chicana, but she was the first, Mexican-American person on record born in the city of Racine, Wisconsin, and one of the first folks that's on record of being born in Wisconsin. And she is an educator. She was instrumental in starting the bilingual education program in the town that she's from. My grandfather was a migrant worker over there, and grandparents had a story of this type of work, and their blood, that struggle and that stuff really became really hard for me to reconcile with when I wasn't doing the things that I think I needed to do. So I spent those 4 years in spiritual sobriety, total sobriety. It was influenced a lot by a lot of the actual Black Power movement. There was a lot of, starting with my uncle, who is an academic. He got his PhD, but a lot of the Black leadership and the Latinx, the Black Student Unity, the Metro folks who were friends. And in my father's circle, my father didn't have a college, neither of my parents have college education, or college degrees anyway, but they were surrounded by a lot of these Machista and Black Student Union folks and the Wanshik, which is the indigenous folks. And so when I got to the military and I was able to pause, I was able to kind of think and reflect a little bit. It was the first time that I've really been healthy. And I think about this, like as kids, a lot of us are running all the time. And so where was the first place that you can be where you put your head on a pillow, it's going to be kind of there in the morning, you eat 3 times a day so that your beta cells can regulate, you have access to basic Geneva conventions, your hygiene, your mail, it's jail, right? And so like the first night you get locked up, you sleep really well. You know what I'm saying? After you get through processing and all the anxiety and all that stuff, like you can go to sleep and you can sleep. And it's such a testament to the state of us that's the place that we got for kids to rest, right? Like that's the first place. But the military it kind of reproduces that, right? So like all of a sudden, like, hey, you had 90% of your life up until this point was trying to access basic needs. You don't got to do that anymore. You can just chill back, and so I started going. I graduated East High School in Madison, Wisconsin with a 1.46 GPA. Now that rounds up to a 1.5.
Right.
And I always say, I learned at MIT that if you didn't know I rounded the first time, that's a 2. So if anyone ever asked you, I had a 2. But so I wasn't an academic, but I started, all of a sudden I was in the Marine Corps and I started going to school and got straight A's, and I just started doing it kind of one piece at a time, and I got straight A's for the rest of my life. And I really started thinking about this, and I mean, this gets a bit, like I said, this is the easy question for, I ended up at war. I was in Fallujah, Iraq, and it's at the end, so I don't know if I'm over here feeling it.
I hear you.
I don't know if any of you guys ever been to that part of the world. It's one of the most beautiful places that exists. It's sacred, and the power that flows through that region, the Euphrates River Basin, is something to be reckoned with. And even though it was such a crazy, chaotic, toxic space in general, the song, the Muslim prayer song at the end of the night coming from the minaret over the dusk, even though you're in the middle of this stuff, it's it's obviously a religious experience, but it's like a spiritual, it's a moment. And like you start out, there's all these internal questions. And I looked at my Iraqi brothers and sisters who I am forever connected to, into the next life, and they look just like my family. If I looked at them and didn't know any different, I would say that looks like a bunch of Chicanos, they look like a bunch, they're us, that's us, like it's me, it's them, and looking at them and really just stopping for a second. And I think in that moment, I was kind of like not like ready to die, but I was at peace with it, right? Because I recognized that like my hands up until that point had been really had just been used for violence. You know, even as a kid, like I was an angry child. I was very violent. And so when I came home and I brought my team back, I still spent another 4 years in the military just because I felt like after you get back from the war, especially then, you come back into this pop culture thing and like people want you to like dance like a bear on a tricycle or something and like tell me the story. But like I knew we were at war, but when you come back here, you can't really tell. And this is kind of what's happened in America is that we can be at war all the time and you don't even notice it out here, right? And so I ended up back in the military for another 4 years, and just at that point, I became hyper focused on who I was and my friends here who were dead and the connections between that and the war and like all this other stuff. And I just became, you know, like, I don't know, it was like a fervent, it just became this thing for me. And I really started focusing and really getting at it. And teaching high school, going out there, and I needed those kids. You know, I'll never be able to repay them, but those children, kids with character, children who reject the hypocrisy of mainstream educational spaces and institutions, call them what you will. They welcome me into their space and they allow me to be in there to help them learn algebra. And it, you know, and like having that space to reflect and to think about the commonalities and like our common ground, right, in terms of our peoples. And you know, there was this situation I was teaching these kids, and I remember I just made this comment in passing to this group of kids. One of them isn't with us anymore, but I said, you know, isn't it great that we live here in San Diego at the time? And I was looking out there over the bay, and this girl said, you know, it would be great. Oh no, it wasn't he said, it was Israel, but he said it would be great except for we got those ships, the Navy ships. And they're like they're ugly. You know, he was just speaking aesthetically. They're ugly. They're sitting in the harbor, and he was a tagger, and he was like, they should let me go to work on the side of them. You know what I'm saying? So we could tag them up. And this girl was like, well, that ruins it because those are like weapons of war and imperialism, and like our art is a spirit of, you know, it's a focus of love. And this other dude, without even missing a beat, was like, right, but if we did that to those things, you know, because of the art is so powerful, no one would ever be able to use those things for war ever again. And that type of thing that was happening around me with these children who, by all estimations, were already, you know what I'm saying, like I speak of dispossession, and they were the most brilliant individuals. And they lifted me up. And you know, so I kind of spiritually started going to bodies of water and talking to them, you know, just being present and really trying to figure out what I was doing. And I learned, you know, and but I still felt like I was running a lot. And so I was fortunate. I ended up many years later, a couple degrees later in San Francisco in the Mission District. And there was some folks with the Mission Peace Collaborative in the Mission District who put their wings around me. And they settled, and even though I was at this point, we're talking 2015, right? So we're not, you know, this is an ancient history. And they recognized that there was a degree of, even though there was good passion and everything else, that there still was aggression, and there was still something that was haunting me. And they taught me about the story of Coyote, and I invite folks, there's so many interpretations. One of the cool things about that story is that it kind of transcends, it crosses, and it's similar in a lot of things. They told me about Coyote and who I was and where I fit in this thing, and that I had to come at this a different way. And I realized that even, you know, I had been running from Madison forever, and it's one thing to run, you know, and it's another thing to come back on your own terms. And I think for me now, the trick to being, you know, Chicano or Mexican in Madison is don't ever get stuck here. And so long as I'm here on my own, you know, however people feel about the movie, there's a movie called Natural Born Killers. There's a story that's told in this movie, but basically it's someone that raises a snake from being frozen, nurses it back to health. The snake gets back to health, and then it bites it, and it bites the person. The person says, hey, what's up, man? You know, I thought I nursed you back to health. Why'd you bite me? And the snake said, hey, look, you know I was a snake. And so I think about Madison that way, right? Like if you guys have ever seen the movie The Last Black Man in San Francisco, there's a really great thing from the protagonist at the end where there's some younger folks on a bus who were complaining about how they hate San Francisco. And he was saying, like, you can't say that because you have to love it, right? you can't understand hate unless you understand pure love. And so the idea of love and approaching these things through a lens of love, even though it represents a lot of pain. I mean, home is home. It doesn't mean that it's good, right? It's painful. Sometimes that's what it is. What's the Aristotle's, the unexamined life is not worth living. And Malcolm X's take on that was the examined life is painful. And so I guess that's where I'll leave you guys with tonight. So thank you all. I really appreciate you welcoming me into your space. I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you,
And
Justice.
we'll see you on the streets.
All right. Well, a few of us are still here. The diehards, the go-longs. Hey, Nathaniel, how are you? Let's switch up my view here so I can see more folks. Okay, great. Hey, Yolanda, good to see you. Hi, Valerie, Allison. Couple folks are new to me. Hey, Susan Crossley, you're here. You're not new to me. Hey, Mandy, Caroline, Celeste. Good to see you in the house, Celeste. And Jean Wright, hello. Elizabeth, Hannah, Bob, Catherine, Judith, and Dean. So friends, if you'd like to have some more discussion, we can certainly do that. Hi, Trish, and Jim. Hi, Jim Fisher. Good to see you. Good to see you. Oh, Yolanda's got her hand up. Okay, go ahead, Yolanda.
Thank you for hosting this. This was amazing. I used to live in Louisville. And so when you were speaking, Britt, about the redlining, it was the same in Lexington, because that's, you know, the area where I grew, where I was working and lived and raised my children in that area. And part of why it's been so hard to accept the killing of Breonna Taylor, the murder of her, is because of redlining. And as more details came out about why she was murdered, you know, it was so senseless, and it's been so hard, you know, because I am a Kentucky native. And so, you know, I'm very familiar with how we lost a farm. We lost a over 60 acre farm in Lincoln County, Kentucky, because they would not give us the financing. We were Black. And, you know, and so my son, his desire is to own a farm again. And his father, that led to the alcoholism. I mean, he just got so depressed. We just lost Albert last year in August. Wow. And, you know, the pandemic didn't help because he was very, you know, he was very isolated. We since divorced after everything fell apart with the farm and all that kind of stuff. And so but we remained good friends over, you know, like our friendship lasted over 40 years. And so it's like, you know, I lost my best friend. And so, and it was because we were not able to get the funding that we needed, even though we had the equity in the land. But because we were young and we hadn't been working that long, you know, and established as far as that goes. I was teaching, but you know what I'm saying? You have to have a certain, you know, it was what it was. And so when all of these things, as I listened to Justice tonight, it just brought all that back to me. And I was talking with a gentleman at the Y day before yesterday who happens to be a Black farmer. He owns some land in Kentucky, but lives here in Cincinnati. And it's a farm in northern Kentucky, the same situation. He's been discriminated against for, you know, getting funding, getting resources to get equipment. I mean, it was the same thing we ran into in the 80s. And so it's so frustrating to me. And, you know, and it's like I owned a home previously, and then my son had some issues with his trucking company, and I had co-signed my home as kind of like a lien. They put a lien on my house and loaned him the money. And then when the economy got really bad in '08 and he had, had issues with his trucks, I lost my house because, it was just one of those things that couldn't be helped. And so little did I realize that my aunt knew, knowing all this, she passed 4 years ago and she blessed me with her home.
Wow.
And so that's why I'm in Cincinnati now, because, I ended up moving to Louisville. I had to retire from teaching because of my back, but then that prompted me into this depression. So then I became a peer support specialist. And one of the better places that would hire me, that, I could make a good, addendum to what I was bringing home as a pension, happened to be in Louisville. And so trying to find safe housing in Louisville, I ended up in Middletown because that was where I felt safe, as a single parent with my daughter. But it took the majority of my check, my disability check, to just live there because I made too much to fit into any program. And I didn't want to be in the West End. Nothing against the people who live in the West End, but it was dangerous. And so I fully get what he was saying. And as a matter of fact, I have friends who are in Madison, Wisconsin that I met when I was doing some like a program with, I used to travel a lot with the mental health work I was doing. And so they happened to be at a conference in St. Louis. And so that's where I happened to meet them. But he is a psychologist, a Black psychologist. And, his wife, they have a business there together. So I'm anxious to get in touch with them and just, see how things are going, because it was just, wow, this was just nice.
Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your story, Yolanda.
Well, thank you all for listening.
And, and helping us see, how one thing can change so much, the pattern and the direction of a person's life. And it is a very complex topic. And as I'm sure you all realize, Justice has been in academia for a while, because he was bringing it. So Justice, wait, break it down for us a little bit. But I was so excited about this because when we, as I said earlier, it's difficult sometimes to really appreciate the implications of racism and how one thing can change and affect so many lives in so many different ways. One of the things that I'd like us to consider, and before I forget, if you're new here and you'd like to get our notifications by email about our upcoming topics, I put my email address in there. It's rhrj@gmail.com for racial healing, racial justice. And just send an email. We don't spam. I keep them to a minimum. They're very straightforward. And that way you'll also know when this recording is available as well on our YouTube channel, which you can also subscribe to. So, okay, I got my plug in. And speaking of plugs, I gotta do one more, which is for our next presentation, which is gonna be another very deep one, if you will. And it's by Todd Rutstein and Shure Cope. And Shure is here with us today, all the way from Panama, people. You want to wave, Shure? So everyone knows who you are. There she is. There she is. And they're putting together a discussion, conversation. It's going to be a slightly different kind of, it's not going to be so much a presentation as it will be a conversation about a new way of thinking and being, eliminating patterns of thought and behavior rooted in whiteness. And I'm sure we'll have a part 2 to that, maybe, there'll be offshoots from that, because again, it's one of those topic areas that is so deep and so complex. But in that conversation, they'll also be sharing with us, excuse me, let me pull it up here real quick. I just had it here. The description, I want to be accurate here, and because it'll go out in the email as well. Let's see, come up email. Nope, I filed it. I filed too quickly. I filed things too quickly. Sorry, but thank you for bearing with me here. I'm just a click away, just a click away. Here we go. So here's the description. Let's see, one more. Okay. And it is, in order to eliminate racial prejudice, it will be necessary to explore the patterns of thought and expression that bolster its foundation. This exploration can, in turn, raise our capacities to challenge the ways we have been conditioned to perceive reality. In this discussion, we will examine the basis of specific modes of thinking and expressing, and present an alternative prototype that upends the white conceptualization of the world, our places in it, and the consequences for both frameworks. So that's to give you an idea of what that's going to be about. So I hope, I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you there as well. So Britt had her hand up, and Judy now has her hand up too. Britt, are you still here?
Hi, Sherlyn.
Oh, there she is. Yeah.
I just was writing to Yolanda through the private message, because Yolanda, I'd love to meet you. I was really touched also deeply by the murder of Breonna Taylor. I teach at the community college where she studied here, and it changed my life and really made me get involved in Louisville, showing up for racial justice, which is an organization that calls white people into the work of racial justice. And I've learned so much from that organization, but I still have so much more to learn, and really appreciate your sponsoring this evening tonight, Shirley.
Oh, thank you, thank you. And yes, we all have that humble posture of learning here, because we all know there is so much we need to learn. And we're really grateful to have you in the mix with us. Really, it's just awesome. And let's see, who else? Someone else had their hand up, and now I've lost you. Judy, it was Judy, wasn't it?
Yes,
Judy?
yes,
Yes,
it is.
where are you, Judy?
Thank you, Sherilyn. I'm just that big white flower there.
Oh, okay, okay.
I just wanted to say a couple of things. I'm so sorry that Judy Amber, I think she just left not long ago, and we knew each other well. I lived in the Madison Bahá'í community in the mid 90s, 90, 94, 95, around in there. And I just wanted to make a couple of comments based on Justice's talks that, you know, just sort of confirm that even when the time that I lived in Madison, what a really segregated city it was. I moved in toward the end of my years there. I moved into what was a borderline integrated, but mostly Black community. And I was told that, I always tell this story because I was told that I should not move there because it was a bad neighborhood. And that was by Baha'is as well as other white people. And I got very angry at the time. And I said, so to you, Black means bad. That's, you know, that's all you hear, it's bad. And then the other thing I wanted to confirm that he talked about was the transportation is just horrible, the public transportation system. It's designed, I had no car then, and I was working as a home nurse. And I had to sometimes travel, like he said, for an hour and a half in waiting in frigid weather for buses to get from one side of the city to the other, because the neighborhood that I was going to work was a mixed race neighborhood in a different part of the city. And the other thing that I wish you would have maybe talked about a little bit more, that those of us in Madison know about, is the South Asian community. That there were at least at that time, there were Vietnamese and Hmong. And that was an interesting dynamic, because the Vietnamese people that were my patients had to live in the so-called Black neighborhoods.
Right.
And there was animosity because as immigrants, they had, you know, all the wrong feelings about Black people. And so I loved hearing this because I could really identify to everything that he was talking about in terms of Madison. And I'm sorry to hear that it's the same or worse.
Yeah, thank you, Judy. And in fact, I'm back. Like Justice, I'm not originally from here, but you know, I came here for graduate school. You know, I was one of those, you know, educated, you know, Black people that came in, and he's totally right, you know, about this great university environment that's very diverse, you know, and all of this, and it's great. But then after my kids were grown, I left and went back east where I'm originally from. And then I just recently moved back about just a couple months ago. And because I have my grandchildren here and one of my daughters is here. And there's a lot of work to be done here because I started reconnecting with the community with, you know, George Floyd and that very important letter that we received, you know, from the National Spiritual Assemblies of the Baha'is of the United States on racial justice, a path forward, June 16th, 2021. You know, it made it very clear what we need to be doing and focusing on, a restatement of what we've been instructed to work on since the early 1900s. And to sum it up real quick, but so I was, you know, watching through Zoom and, you know, getting re-engaged with what was going on in Madison because I have family here, I cared. And there was a lot happening here in Madison and some of it good, you know, because there were communities of color standing up and speaking out and making space and finding space. So yeah, but on the transportation, I just want to let you know, I just saw an article that said that they're even reducing even further the routing for buses. And when I lived here, my youngest daughter was working, you know, we lived in a not affluent neighborhood, but close, you know, and but it took her hour and a half, 2 hours to get from where we lived, which wasn't that far from the mall where she worked. And now they're reducing the number of transit points. So you have to go even further now just to get to a place where you can get the bus. It's, yeah, so when we really get into the particulars of some of it, it's just
You know, Sherilyn, as you're saying that, it's Judy again, that it just strikes me, it's exactly like what happened in Africa. So in Africa, you could not fly from country to country. There were no flights. The flights were all from, you know, the colonial countries. You know, you could fly from, you know, London to Nairobi. You could fly from London to South Africa. But you could not fly from Nairobi to places in South Africa because it was all revolved around the white people that were going. And it's only recently that airlines have been set up so you can fly from country to country. And isn't that a similarity of what they're doing in Madison?
That sure is. That's amazing. I never knew that. My goodness. Wow. And Celeste is shaking her head there. She's on that. She knows what you're talking about. Wow, that's news to me. My goodness. That's what I love about these after chats because, you know, we learn so much more, you know, and we just go on and on. We're not going to go too late tonight, but but we do go on and on. Dave, you had your hand up. Dave, what you got?
Hi, well, just on the, this is not what I was going to talk about, but the transportation, we lived in Germany. I lived there for 5 years and they are so used to public transportation that you can get anywhere and it goes fast. There's a trolley that goes to the bus, it goes to the train. We were there a few years ago to visit and we did the whole thing public transportation. It's possible, but in this country, it would have to be so heavily subsidized.
Yes.
Just to break the habits that people have of hopping in the car. It has to be done, though. It has. We have to reinstitute it. It was destroyed by GM and very consciously. And I recommend to everybody listening, the book is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And he goes through the whole history of this redlining, how it was developed, who instituted it, how widespread it was. It was not just the public housing. It was loans and all these covenants that were formed. It was just so blatant. Up until so recently, people have no idea really how pervasive that whole system was, and it still needs to be broken up. People need to be aware of it. And also two books that really explain how privilege is just so dominant are two books. I think David Johnston. One of it is called Perfectly Legal, and the other one is Free Lunch.
Okay, I'll look both of those up. And one of the things that I do after our sessions when there are references to things, well, first, before the video goes up, I watch the whole thing all over again. So I can pull out, references or things like this and pull them out and include that information, in my follow-up email to you saying, okay, this session is now available. Here are the things, that were of interest that we'll reference. So I'll be getting that information to include in that for folks. And that's helpful for folks that can't make the session as well. One thing I'd like to do right now is take the conversation in a slightly different direction. And there's two things. One is, what are your takeaways from this? And so, but what did you learn? But more importantly, learning is not enough. We can't stop at learning. So I think for me, at least, this conversation in my mind begs the question, what kind of social action can people take? What can we do? And, one of the things that, at least from a Baha'i perspective, speaking of my own understanding, of things, let me be, personal. When Justice said, that there's no political resolution to this, I thought, what a great example. Because from a Baha'i perspective, we see it more as a moral solution, right? It's not, yes, we need to have legislation and laws change and do all of those things. Don't deny those things. We're not political, so we don't engage in partisan politics. But justice, and we're talking about justice here, is a social issue. And it's beyond, any partisan divides. And when we talk about civics, so let's think about civics, right? Civic engagement, civic involvement. In my view, I don't see that as being political. Now, sometimes the processes of how one gets on committees and boards and things is political, I'm sure. But I think as individuals, we have opportunities within places for civic participation, where we can engage. One in particular that was mentioned, yeah, white people that are in those places, you can get on those committees and those boards and, and things like that. So that's one avenue of social action, that I'm taking away from this. So I'd like to hear from folks, what other types of, and the other question that I wanted to put on our minds is, how has what we've learned tonight or come to better understand this evening the thorns on the path of justice these long thorns that Justice pointed out to us, okay? All of these obstacles and boulders and, you know, right? How do we now think about our community building work in communities, recognizing, look at the turnover rate. You know, we see this ourselves, those of us that are engaged in children's classes and youth programming and things like that, just as an example. And we may not have answers tonight, but I just want us to kind of just put the thought in there. You know, how does this impact? How does this inform, you know, what we are doing? Does it give us some direction, some insights, some new perspectives in which to look at things and to understand, you know, what's going on and how we can be more effective in empowering local communities, right? Because that's what we're about, empowering the individual. So yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, thank you so much. So Jean, you have your hand up, and then Caroline, it looks like you were gonna go next. Okay, I see you, Caroline. Go ahead, Jean. Oh, you're on mute, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I have to listen to my computer tell me where it is, so.
Right.
And now, where was I going? Oh, I know. Talking about getting involved, one of the things we've been doing or attempting to, especially, you know, now that COVID, we had talked about it a lot, is that there are many organizations that are really involved in community building. And so I am going to join our local NAACP chapter, because they historically have historically worked on all issues regarding, you know, the advancement of Black people and justice and what have you. So that's one thing I want to do. And in Minneapolis, there is an organization called the Center for Nonviolence, and they've given some wonderful workshops. So they're going to get a membership too. So just starting out with those kinds of things, but in action, you know, it's, I mean, and I love sitting and complaining and arguing about this stuff, but you know, you need to get off your, and just as for me, not you, get off your duff and see where you can help. And I mean, neighborhood community centers and, you know, working with children. Children are the ones who our futures lie in. So, you know, that's just my suggestion. So
thank you, Jean. That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Caroline and then Judy.
I wish some of the people who were here tonight earlier have left who are involved in this, but it's in Milwaukee. There's a program where they've been trying to, because people here know, I'm sure that research has shown that families, children who are raised in poverty are more likely to continue that cycle into adulthood. But they found that children who are able to grow up in an area that is not poverty have this opportunity, they have a greater opportunity to break that cycle as adults.
Of course.
And so in Milwaukee, there is an organization that is trying to encourage affordable housing in areas that would typically not be open to them. And so, and this is really through Kathy Wurtzer, where she, through some of the organizations that she works with, heard about this and brought it to the Baha'is and said, here's how we can help. And so those Baha'is who are living in these areas that were primarily white, the problem was that it wasn't long-term successful, because you might have someone from the inner city, a family moving out, but then you have all kinds of things going on there and it's not welcoming. And they need a friend, they need assistance, they need support. And then they need people to look for housing that can be pulled into this program. So there are ways the Baha'is could help, and there are there are several Baha'i families in these areas that have joined with this, and they are actively involved in it, and it's not political, and it's a wonderful thing. And where I live is not one of the areas, so, but it's it is really something, and it's just a matter of connections and relationships with these organizations that started this whole thing.
Thank you, Caroline. Thanks very much. Judy?
Yeah, some of you know that Dean and I have been doing what we call racial justice book studies now here in our little community in Florida for a year.
I didn't know, so tell us about that.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, we've been doing it consistently. And it's amazing how you get confirmed when you just continue to do something, because we now have actually the Interfaith United, which is the interfaith group for the whole city of Melbourne, has asked to collaborate with us.
Wow.
So we are now, it's us, the Baha'i community, Dean and I mainly, and this interfaith group, and we're attracting more and more people, and even some of our African Americans. And but what I wanted to say related to what you said is that it's a very tricky thing, because we just finished studying the book The Sum of Us, and if you haven't read that, I really highly recommend it. That's another one to think about reading. One of the things that we wanted to come out of this, because Dean and I have been wanting this, ever since we started, is to form an interracial group in Brevard County that is working toward racial justice. So at our last meeting, which was sort of a follow-up meeting of the finishing of the book, we asked everyone to come and talk about what we could do locally, just like you're kind of asking about these issues. All of the racial justice issues. The book is great because it focuses on each one: redlining, voting rights, everything. And what we ran into, which is, I think, even when Justice was talking about Madison, is our society has become so divided, and it has been divided along party lines and among ideological lines, that it's very difficult, because some of our African American friends really want us to focus on supporting candidates that support a racial justice agenda. And although that sounds good in theory, the problem is even if you say, well, I like this person's, agenda, I like what this person's platform is, there's still a party involved. And that can even be true. We started thinking, well, what about things like school boards? So you look at the school board candidates and you say, well, what do they support? But it seems like even they are sometimes identified with political parties. So so we kind of left this discussion with, okay, because also the Interfaith Council, Interfaith United, in their articles of whatever you call it, they're not also supposed to be political. So that fits in very well with us as Baha'is. But that's where we're kind of stumped, is that even when how do we become involved? How do we become allies? How do we become, with all these committees and whatever, that doesn't somehow end up being political?
Yeah.
And if anybody has any ideas about that, I sure appreciate hearing them.
Yeah, that's a great question. That really is. And I think, we're going to be increasingly faced with that as we get more and more into social action, right? In our communities. Just off the top of my head, and I really am encouraging other people in here, to speak to this who are more knowledgeable than me, like Jim Fisher or Celeste Dixon. I'm calling you guys out. I'd like to hear your viewpoints, Sheree. and I'm calling them because I know them and they've got a couple years on me, I think, in terms of the knowledge base, right? But, when we vote for president or, senators and that kind of thing, they're all associated with a party. You can't get around that, okay? But we still vote. You still have the option to vote. That's your choice. So on the one hand, that would certainly apply, at the more local level, right? Aldermen, council people, whatever. Okay, so they're attached to a party. Who do I think, has, the best ethical standards?
The idea, though, is getting other people to support a candidate that you support. And will they identify?
Campaigning.
Yeah.
Oh,
No, I don't even mean campaigning so much as like, okay, say a school board rep is for somebody who's running for school board is supportive of the 1619 curriculum.
Okay.
And so you say, vote for so-and-so because, they're against the, the anti, what do you call it? The racial.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
But
And
if it looks like you support, and people are urging us to do that because it will help them to be elected.
I see.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but yeah.
No. I'm glad you did because I wasn't fully understanding the circumstance that you were describing. Yeah. Jim, I see you're ready. You're off mute. Go ahead, Jim.
In Greenbelt, Maryland, where I live, there's a lot of activists, and some of them seem to like the Baha'is. They think that our contribution can be to help them not fight each other, and so they need that kind of thing. I think that we have some success in creating spaces for discussion like we are having right now, and that may be very useful. I don't know how to solve the candidate problem.
Yeah. Celeste?
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
I'd like to chime in there in support of what Jim just said. Because we are learning consultation, and we should study the book on it if you haven't already, folks. It really helps you to understand how you create a calm, consultative space where you can talk about everything you need to talk about, great and small, without any contention or antagonism. So the way you approach the discussion, we bring leavening, if you will, leaven to the discussions of other folks, so they can talk to each other. And where people want to throw a lot of politics around, the dangerous thing away from partisan politics. So, you're going to have discussions where people are going to try to bring the partisanship in. What you're keeping away from is the partisan part. But because we do vote, and that is our right as a citizen, and it says, the writings doesn't say we cannot vote, but you just don't take a position on any party. You are non-affiliated to any party, and that includes independents. That's a party. The Green Party is a party. So you're non-affiliated with any party, but you just simply tell people, I'm looking at the character of the persons who are running, and their experience for what they want to represent. And that's how you make your decision who you choose when you vote. And you do not have to have a discussion with them about all the details, and you can choose to, but once you vote, you don't have to tell anybody who you voted for. Remember, voting is a private matter. You don't have to talk about that, because once a person is elected, then that's your representative, and you have to work with them, period. Good, bad, or indifferent. And one of the things I did, right now, I'm not serving on any community programs, but when I was living in a different county than I am now, and I'm in Maryland, when I was in Montgomery County, they had a citizens advisory board for their transit system. And, they gave you the criteria of how you apply to get on that, and you serve for 2 years. And so I did. And the issue was to expand the bus system to make it more user-friendly to seniors,
Right.
disabled, and the poor, which means adding more stops or bus length of time the buses ran in certain areas, based on the fact that many of the people who needed to ride the buses were people who had to go to jobs that, like you said, going to the mall, going to a restaurant, or making connections to the metro to get downtown, and you got to be able to get home at very late hours. And does mass transit serve their purpose? Because they, for whatever reasons, they have no personal transportation to get to or from work. So, you can serve on those kinds of boards, taxi boards and mass transit boards and sidewalk boards and public spaces boards. And, all of those things are important for community to be healthy and embrace everybody and to be loving and to serve. So just look at what the need of the community is, and I'm sure you can find a niche you can plug yourselves into. And all of this, and out of all of this generates a concern for the love of the greater community. And you can also, it also brings in the element of elevated conversations about loving everybody and why there is a problem with any particular group of people. And then if you do your homework and read up on the history of what the problems are, as Justice was talking about, you bring an element of education to it, because part of the ignorance out there is a lack of education on what the truth is. So people are ignorant of the truth, and it doesn't mean they're going along with it because they like it. Sometimes they're just plain ignorant of the truth. So we can educate ourselves and educate others as well. So however deep you want to get into that, you dive in. I often have, but I grew up doing that all the time. I was always the kid of 20,000 questions. So I needed to understand the why and the how and the where. And if this happened, well, what was all the background behind the story? What's the background story? Why is that important to know? So ask yourself those questions and maybe ask others that. And, everybody has to be willing to do a little homework.
Thank you. Just awesome. Jim, you want to tap that off?
I'll make a half a point that I just love what Celeste said. And when I found that when I got into the local groups supporting community activities, that I made a lot of friends, and they all know about Baha'i faith now somehow, so a little bit because of that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I see another presentation coming, because I'm going to ask you and Celeste to come on. No, I'm very serious. This is where I get a lot of our presentations from. Have you guys come and talk about civic engagement? That's really important for us, to learn more about.
Yeah. I got one other book for you guys too.
Okay, go ahead.
The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap by I guess she pronounces her name Mirza Bahá'í-inspired. I mean, this is the book right here.
Okay.
But The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap. So The Color of Law and that book, those are two important ones to understand. So you understand how economically, with redlining and the other history, how the banks economically worked against Black and brown people in not helping us to build generational wealth.
Okay. But I'm serious. I'm going to contact you both, and maybe you'd like to do something together individually and share your experiences and knowledge about civic engagement, because that really is important. And as we're trying to venture out.
They need team up, Jim.
What'd you say?
Sounds good. I said Jim and I need to team up on that one.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. Dave?
I just a comment for Judy. I think if anybody asks a question like that again, just use that as a wonderful teaching opportunity to tell them about how Baha'is select. It's the only system where you can select people who really don't want to run. And you get the good ones.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. And that, that reminded me, the primary reason, well, I shouldn't say primary, but at least the most evident reason to me why we don't participate in partisan politics is because it's inherently divisive. You know, so if you're asking me to say I support this candidate, I can say I like their ideas, or I like this particular idea, but I also like, well, maybe there's something I also like in the other one. Well, how are you going to vote? Well, I'm looking at their character, their track record. Are they reliable? Are they truthful? You know, right? You know, but yeah, it's because you don't want to be, you're not interested in taking a side. You're looking at the whole. We're looking at the whole, and that's why, you know, we don't go partisan. You know, so yeah, great discussion, you guys. Who brought this up? Anybody else? There's a couple folks here. Judy, that was just wonderful. Thank you for bringing that topic up, and this was so helpful for me. I mean, you know, and I tell you folks, you know, when you look at our YouTube channel and you see like, oh my God, that was 3.5 hours, you know, take it in pieces, you know, but don't skip the after conversation, because it has a special quality to it that we don't get anywhere else. And, you know, it feeds off of, you know, the presentation and the discussion, you know, and so on. And I'm always open. So if you have ideas of topics or presenters, people you know or may have heard elsewhere that you think would bring something of value, you know, to our learning and education, you know, please shoot me an email. As well, that's most welcome. We're booked up. Let me just share real quickly who else we have coming up. Our calendar's full almost for the whole year now, and we're booked into January and February. For those of you that were here last year when we did the Praise Prayer Devotional Potlatch, it's coming back, people. It's coming back. March 26th. We're bringing it back. And that was just so much fun. Oh my God, it was just so much fun. And it was just wonderful. People from everywhere, all faiths, all races, you know, the whole human family. Come and share your praise, your culture, your love of God, your love of humanity. And it was just a wonderful. It's on the YouTube channel too, if you want to check out what I'm talking about, if you weren't able to be there. But we're going to do it again in March, and we're also going to take a break in February, straddling February and March. But you'll get a new schedule coming up pretty soon, and I'm working to get it posted somewhere as soon as I can lock a couple people down on their topics. Then we can go with that. But also in August, Dr. Layli Mapayan is going to return, and she's got a discussion about Black women and spirituality, where healing and justice meet. And she's hoping to bring in 2 friends from different faith backgrounds to talk about spirituality and healing and justice, you know, with her. Then September, we've got the importance of being earnest with Jeff Ewing. And then following him, tentatively, Michael O'Neill will be sharing his parent university with us. That's out of Georgia, I think it is. Excuse me. So, and then police dialogues in October is coming up. We'll have a revisit on healing again. And then November, Masood Olufani, Power to the Pupil, and a more detailed look at exploring foundations of white supremacy ideology and advancing frameworks for oneness and justice with Kim Kelsey. And then a really special treat. Oh my God, you guys are gonna love this. You thought the Praise Prayer Devotional Potlatch was good? Mark this date, December 11th, Nancy Ewing is going to do her presentation. If you were at the Arise conference, you saw this maybe. It's theater as a tool for meaningful and challenging conversation. And then she has an interactive experience. So we're going to be interacting Now she's a professional actor and she does theater. And she's going to do a theatrical presentation and we're going to get to interact with that presentation. I can't tell you anymore. I'm on a gag order because it's kind of got to be, you know, a bit of a surprise, but it's not going to be the usual sit and listen. You know, you'll get to be a lot more engaged, you know, other than just at the end of the presentation. So it's going to be super exciting. And I do have one tentatively date open, and that's December 25th. I'm going to take it if no one else does, but I'm hoping someone else does. And if I do, I'm just going to try and pull together so far, and I appreciate some suggestions and ideas and thoughts. It's part of the reason why I'm sharing this with you guys. I'm tentatively titling it, Smoothing the Long and Thorny Path Toward Racial Justice, Bring Your Toolbox. And by toolbox, I mean, what are some of the things we're learning and have learned that are helpful to us? Or there are some things I've learned about I haven't been able to get someone to formally present on in this space, but I at least want to introduce the ideas, you know, to our audience. So that's kind of what that's about, you know, sort of an overview, you know, of some key things that, yeah, kind of like a reflection of the last year and a half, going on 2 years of this. So yeah, so thank you so much, friends. Okay, so I think it's almost, well, it's almost 11 for some of you on the East Coast. Yeah, I'm in the Midwest now, thank God. Oh, but Nathan and Julian, yeah, they're gonna take us out of here. But again, thank you all for coming and staying and being part of this. You really make it what it is. And we're really grateful to have you here with us. So Nason and Jillian, you're gonna take us home now. We love you. Thank you for coming and have a great week and we'll see you soon. Bye.